Tonight, we travel back in time to uncover one of humanity's oldest and most controversial relationships. A story that spans 10,000 years, crosses every continent, and touches upon medicine, spirituality, economics, and the darkest corners of human prejudice. This is the story of cannabis, a plant that has been revered as sacred, prescribed as medicine, woven into the fabric of civilizations, and condemned as the devil's harvest. Before we begin, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Perhaps you're settling in for the night. The world outside your window growing quiet and still. Maybe you're watching the last rays of sunlight fade beyond the horizon, or perhaps darkness has already claimed the sky, and you're seeking a gentle companion for these quiet hours. Wherever you are, whatever time has brought you here, let yourself sink deeper into comfort. Tonight's journey will be long, winding through the centuries like smoke rising from ancient braziers, drifting across continents and cultures, revealing secrets that have been buried, celebrated, forgotten, and remembered again. Close your eyes for a moment if you can. Imagine the weight of 10 millennia pressing down like layers of earth, each stratum containing its own stories, its own truths. We're going to peel back these layers together, slowly, methodically, beginning at the very dawn of human civilization and moving forward through time until we arrive at this precise moment. Here, now, with you listening to these words. The question seems simple enough. When did people start smoking weed? But like all simple questions about human history, the answer branches and spreads like the leaves of the cannabis plant itself, reaching in unexpected directions, connecting to stories you might never have anticipated. This isn't just a tale about a plant. It's a story about humanity's eternal search for healing, for transcendence, for connection to something greater than ourselves. It's about how we've used nature's gifts, how we've honored them, and how we've demonized them when they threaten the powerful. So settle in, make yourself comfortable. This journey will take us from the misty prehistoric valleys of ancient China to the frozen burial mounds of Siberian warriors. We'll walk through the sacred temples of India, where gods and mortals alike found enlightenment in a sacred herb. We'll stand beside Egyptian pharaohs and Greek historians, Scythian shamans and Victorian physicians. We'll witness the transformation of a revered medicine into a feared narcotic, and we'll explore how racism, politics, and propaganda reshaped our relationship with one of Earth's oldest cultivated plants. The night is long, but we have time. Let the story unfold at its own pace, like smoke dispersing slowly into the evening air. Our story begins not with a date, but with a place. Imagine, if you will, the island of Taiwan, off the coast of mainland China. 10,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. The world was younger then, in the sense that human civilization was just learning to walk. The last ice age had only recently released its grip on the planet. Glaciers that had covered much of the northern hemisphere for millennia were retreating, revealing land that hadn't seen sunlight in ages. The climate was warming, rivers were flowing, and humanity was beginning to transform from wandering hunters to settled farmers. On Taiwan, in what archaeologists would later identify as a Stone Age settlement, people were beginning to experiment with the materials around them. They needed containers for food and water. They needed tools. They needed rope strong enough to bind, fabric durable enough to wear, materials that could withstand the demands of daily life in a harsh and unforgiving world. Among the debris of this ancient community, scattered like whispered secrets through the layers of time, archaeologists have found something remarkable. Pieces of broken pottery, their surfaces decorated with an unusual pattern. When these pottery shards were examined closely, researchers realized that the decorations weren't painted or carved. They were impressions, created by pressing twisted cords into the wet clay before it hardened. And these cords, these twisted fibers that left their mark in the clay more than 10,000 years ago, were made from cannabis. Think about that for a moment. 10,000 years, that's roughly 500 human generations. It's twice as long as recorded history. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by 7,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. When these early humans on Taiwan were pressing hemp cords into wet clay, the written word didn't exist. Agriculture was just being invented. The wheel hadn't been dreamed of. And yet, even then, even at the very dawn of human civilization, people had discovered the cannabis plant and had learned to use it. But fiber wasn't the only gift cannabis offered to these early humans. Scattered among the same archaeological debris, researchers found long, rod-shaped tools that look remarkably similar to instruments used in later centuries for a very specific purpose: separating cannabis fibers from their stems. This suggests that even in the Stone Age, people weren't just stumbling upon cannabis plants and using whatever they found. They were cultivating the plant, processing it, understanding its properties. The discovery that twisted strands of fiber were stronger than the individual ones was revolutionary. It meant that humans could create rope, and with rope came the ability to bind, to drag, to lift, to build. They could weave these fibers into fabric, freeing themselves from dependence on animal skins for clothing. This was not a small thing. This was the beginning of textile technology, and cannabis fiber, also known as hemp, was at its very foundation. But when did people discover that this useful plant had other properties? When did someone first notice that burning cannabis created smoke with unusual effects? When did humanity first experience the psychoactive properties of this remarkable plant? The truth is, we don't know exactly when this discovery was made. What we do know is that for thousands of years, cannabis was valued primarily for its fiber. Archaeological evidence from ancient China shows that hemp was being cultivated extensively by at least 5000 BCE, during what historians call the Yangshao culture period. The Yangshao people lived along the Yellow River Valley, in an area that would become the heartland of Chinese civilization. They were farmers, growing millet and rice, raising pigs and dogs. They made pottery, not just for practical use but as art, decorating their vessels with intricate patterns, and they grew hemp, lots and lots of hemp. Hemp fiber imprints have been found on Yangshao pottery dating back to the 5th millennium BCE. That's 7,000 years ago. Think about how long that really is. 7,000 years ago there was no Rome, no Greece, no Egypt as we know it. Most of Europe was still populated by Stone Age tribes, and yet in China people were already growing hemp as a major agricultural crop. Why hemp? Because it was, quite simply, one of the most useful plants imaginable. The fibers could be woven into clothing that was durable and comfortable. They could be twisted into rope that wouldn't rot in water, making them ideal for fishing nets and ship rigging. Later, around 200 BCE, the Chinese would discover that hemp fibers could be processed to make paper, an invention that would eventually spread across the world and transform human civilization. But cannabis offered more than just fiber. The seeds were edible, rich in oil and protein. They could be eaten raw, pressed for oil, or ground into flour. Ancient Chinese writings describe hemp seeds as one of the 5 main grains, alongside rice, barley, millet, and soybeans. This wasn't some minor crop grown in small patches. This was a staple food, cultivated extensively, essential to survival. And then there were the flowers, the buds, the resinous parts of the plant that didn't make good fiber but produced something else entirely. Compounds that, when heated and inhaled or ingested, created profound changes in consciousness. Substances that could ease pain, induce sleep, spark creativity, or open doors to spiritual realms. The Chinese were definitely aware of these properties by at least 2737 BCE, according to tradition. That's when the legendary Emperor Shen Nung, sometimes called the Divine Farmer, supposedly compiled one of the first pharmacopoeias, or books of medicine, in human history. This text, called the Pen Tizao, listed hundreds of drugs and their uses, and among them was ma, the Chinese word for cannabis. Now here's where we need to pause and acknowledge something important. The original Pen Tizao attributed to Emperor Shen Nung doesn't actually exist anymore, if it ever did. The oldest version we have dates to the 1st century CE, compiled by an unknown author who claimed to have incorporated earlier knowledge. So we can't say with absolute certainty that people in 2737 BCE were using cannabis as medicine. What we can say is that by the 1st century CE, when the extant Pen Tizao was written, cannabis was already considered an ancient medicine, one that possessed both yin and yang, the fundamental opposing forces in Chinese philosophy. The text describes cannabis as useful for treating a remarkable range of conditions including malaria, rheumatism, gout, menstrual problems, and various pains. It was considered especially valuable for its pain-relieving properties, but also for its ability to induce a kind of peaceful mental state. Ancient Chinese physicians understood that cannabis had both medical and psychoactive properties, and they used both aspects deliberately and thoughtfully. Picture an ancient Chinese physician, perhaps in the Han Dynasty, around the 1st or 2nd century CE. He sits in a dim room, light filtering through rice paper windows, the air heavy with the scent of herbs. Before him, a patient writhes in pain, perhaps from an injury, perhaps from disease. The physician carefully measures out dried cannabis flowers, grinds them with other herbs according to ancient formulas passed down through generations. He knows exactly how much to use, knows that too little will provide no relief, and too much might cause unwanted effects. This is precision medicine, practiced thousands of years before the term would be invented. The preparation itself was an art. Cannabis flowers might be dried in the shade to preserve their potency, then stored in ceramic jars sealed with wax. When needed, the physician would select flowers of appropriate age and quality. Fresh flowers had different properties than aged ones. Flowers harvested at different times of year carried different strengths. The female flowers, rich in resin, were prized for their medicinal potency. Male flowers, less resinous, might be used for different purposes or in different formulations. Grinding the flowers released their aromatic oils, filling the treatment room with a distinctive scent that patients would come to associate with relief from suffering. The physician might combine cannabis with ginger to warm the formula and improve circulation, or with licorice root to harmonize the various ingredients and reduce potential side effects, or with chrysanthemum flowers to treat headaches and eye problems. Each formula was tailored to the individual patient's condition, constitution, and symptoms. The method of administration mattered too. For some conditions, cannabis might be prepared as a tea, simmered gently in water to extract its medicinal compounds. The patient would drink this tea slowly, allowing the medicine to warm their body from within. For other conditions, cannabis might be mixed with wine, the alcohol helping to extract different compounds and to carry the medicine more quickly through the body. For topical problems, muscle pain or inflamed joints, cannabis might be ground with other herbs and mixed with oil or fat to create a liniment that could be massaged into affected areas. Surgery, still primitive by modern standards, benefited enormously from cannabis. Ancient Chinese surgeons discovered that patients given cannabis preparations before surgical procedures experienced less pain and remained calmer during the operation. This was revolutionary. Surgery without anesthesia is excruciating. Patients would scream, struggle, sometimes die from shock. But cannabis, while not eliminating pain entirely, took the edge off. It made the unbearable merely difficult. It allowed surgeons to work more carefully, taking time to do procedures properly rather than rushing to finish before the patient's endurance gave out. The great Chinese surgeon Hua Tuo, who lived in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, was famous for his use of cannabis in surgical procedures. Historical texts describe how Hua Tuo would mix cannabis powder with wine, creating a preparation he called mafeisan, which translates roughly as cannabis boiling powder. We see patients who drank this mixture before surgery would fall into a state somewhere between consciousness and unconsciousness, aware of what was happening but feeling little pain, able to follow instructions but not overwhelmed by suffering. Hua Tuo's surgical achievements were remarkable for his time. He performed abdominal surgeries, removed tumours, operated on internal organs, procedures that would have been impossible without some form of anesthesia. And cannabis was his primary tool for pain management. Sadly, the exact formula for mafeisan was lost after Hua Tuo's death. Legend says he wrote it down in a book that was burned, but the historical accounts make clear that cannabis-based anesthesia was real and effective, a crucial medical advance made possible by understanding the plant's properties. Or imagine a Chinese bureaucrat, exhausted from long days of copying documents, his hand cramped from holding a brush, his eyes strained from reading by candlelight. He takes a small amount of cannabis, perhaps mixed with wine, perhaps burned as incense. The tension eases, the mental chatter quiets. For a moment, the endless responsibilities can wait. This too was a recognized use, not medicine in the modern sense, but a tool for maintaining mental equilibrium in a demanding world. But cannabis in China wasn't only about medicine and fiber. It was also deeply woven into daily life in ways that might surprise us. Hemp seeds were a food crop, valued for their nutrition and versatility. They could be eaten raw, roasted like nuts, ground into flour, or pressed for oil. Hemp seed oil was used in cooking, in oil lamps for light, and as a base for paints and lacquers. The oil didn't go rancid quickly, making it practical for storage and trade. Poor families, unable to afford rice or wheat in sufficient quantities, supplemented their diet with hemp seeds. The seeds were filling, nutritious, providing protein and oils that growing children needed. Mothers would cook hemp seed porridge for their families, a simple but nourishing meal that sustained workers through long days of labor. Hemp seeds might be ground with other grains to stretch precious food supplies, or they might be sprouted, creating fresh greens during winter months when other vegetables weren't available. The leaves of the cannabis plant, while not as potent as the flowers, also had uses. Young leaves could be eaten as a vegetable, cooked like spinach or other greens. They were bitter but nutritious, and in times of famine people were grateful for any food they could find. Older leaves, too tough to eat, might be fed to animals or composted to enrich garden soil. And then there was hemp's role in Chinese technological advancement. The invention of paper, one of China's most important contributions to human civilization, depended on hemp. Before paper, the Chinese wrote on bamboo strips, which were heavy and unwieldy, or on silk, which was expensive and available only to the wealthy. But around 200 BCE, Chinese craftsmen discovered that plant fibers could be processed into a material suitable for writing. The process was complex but ingenious. Hemp fibers would be soaked in water until they softened and began to break down. Then they would be beaten and mashed, creating a pulp. This pulp would be spread in thin layers on screens and left to dry. The result was paper, thin sheets that could be written on, rolled into scrolls, bound into books. Early paper was rough, not much better than cloth. But over centuries the process was refined. Different plants were tried, their fibers compared and blended. But hemp remained one of the primary materials, valued for producing strong, durable paper. Think about what this meant. Paper made books affordable. Knowledge that had been available only to the wealthy elite suddenly became accessible to the educated middle class. Ideas could spread more quickly. Education could reach more people. Government could communicate more efficiently. Science and literature could advance more rapidly. And much of this revolution in information technology depended on hemp, on the cannabis plant that ancient Chinese farmers had been growing for thousands of years. But China wasn't the only place where cannabis was being cultivated and used. Around 2000 BCE, or perhaps earlier, the plant made its way to Korea, where hemp fabric has been found in ancient sites dating back 3,000 years. From Korea, it may have spread to Japan, where archaeological sites from around 8000 BCE have yielded what appear to be cannabis seeds, though whether these represent cultivation or simply wild plants is debated. More importantly, cannabis was spreading westward, along trade routes that connected China to Central Asia, Persia, India, and eventually the Mediterranean world. And as it spread, it accumulated new meanings, new uses, new names. Each culture that encountered this remarkable plant found its own ways to understand and employ its properties, which brings us to one of the most important archaeological discoveries in the history of cannabis research, a find that would finally provide concrete scientific evidence for when and where people first began deliberately smoking high-potency cannabis for its psychoactive effects. The Pamir Mountains rise like the spine of the world, straddling what is now western China, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Kyrgyzstan. This is high country, remote and rugged, where the air is thin and the landscape can be brutal. 10,000 feet above sea level, the Pamir Plateau stretches out in a vast expanse of grasslands, rocky outcrops and distant peaks. This has always been a crossroads, a place where cultures met and mingled, where traders from China encountered merchants from Persia, where ideas and goods flowed back and forth along what would later be called the Silk Road. In this remote, windswept landscape at a place called the Jerzunkel Cemetery, archaeologists made a discovery that would rewrite our understanding of cannabis history. The cemetery dates to roughly 500 BCE, about 2,500 years ago. It wasn't a large burial ground, just a small collection of graves, but what those graves contained was extraordinary. Inside several of the tombs, archaeologists found wooden braziers, essentially bowls or containers that had once held burning material. These weren't fancy objects. They were functional, utilitarian. the kind of thing you might use for burning incense or creating smoke for purification or ritual purposes. But these particular braziers were special because of what they contained. Inside the braziers were stones, small rocks that showed clear evidence of having been exposed to high heat. And on those stones, in the cracks and crevices, in the very fabric of the wood itself, researchers found chemical residues. When these residues were analysed using sophisticated modern techniques, gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, they revealed something remarkable. The people buried at Dzirsankal had been burning cannabis. But not just any cannabis. This was cannabis with elevated levels of THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, the primary psychoactive compound in the plant. Let's pause here to understand what this means. For thousands of years, cannabis had been cultivated primarily for fiber and seeds. Most varieties of cannabis, particularly those grown for industrial purposes, contain very low levels of THC. You could smoke a field's worth of hemp fiber and never feel anything more than a sore throat. But at some point, either through deliberate breeding or through lucky accident, certain varieties of cannabis began producing more THC. These were the varieties that ancient people discovered could alter consciousness, ease pain, open doors to spiritual experiences. The cannabis found at Dzirsankal was specifically a high THC variety. This wasn't hemp that happened to be burned accidentally. This was deliberate. The people conducting funerals at this cemetery, on this windswept plateau at the edge of the world, were intentionally burning psychoactive cannabis. But how were they using it? The researchers who excavated the site pieced together a likely scenario based on the physical evidence and on historical accounts from ancient writers. The braziers would have been filled with hot stones, heated in a fire until they were nearly glowing. Then cannabis would have been placed on these hot stones. As the plant material touched the superheated surface, it would have begun to smoke and vaporize, releasing the psychoactive compounds into the air. But the smoke wouldn't just dissipate into the open air. According to ancient accounts from Greek historians, people in this region would create small enclosed spaces, essentially hot boxes, by setting up poles in a triangle or square and covering them with felt or fabric. Inside this enclosed space the brazier would be placed, and people would crawl inside, sitting in the smoke-filled tent, breathing deeply of the cannabis-laced vapour. This matches almost exactly a description written by the Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE, describing funeral practices of the Scythians, a nomadic people who controlled vast territories in Central Asia. But we'll come to Herodotus and the Scythians in a moment. First, let's understand what the Dzirsankal discovery really means. This is the earliest concrete, scientifically verified evidence we have for the deliberate use of psychoactive cannabis. Not fiber, not seeds, but cannabis burned specifically for its mind-altering smoke. And it wasn't recreational in the modern sense. This was part of a funeral ritual, a sacred practice. The dead were being sent off with cannabis smoke, and the living were breathing it too, perhaps to commune with the deceased, perhaps to ease their grief, perhaps to open their minds to spiritual realities that normally remained hidden. Think about the setting. You're standing on a high plateau, cold wind whipping across the grassland. Someone you loved has died. They lie wrapped in cloth or placed in a wooden coffin, soon to be committed to the earth. But before that final separation, before the soil covers them forever, there's this ritual. Poles are set up. Felt mats are stretched across them, creating a small tent barely large enough for a few people to crouch inside. A brazier is brought out, filled with stones that have been heating in the fire until they are almost too hot to look at. Cannabis flowers, carefully harvested and dried, are placed on the stones. Smoke begins to rise immediately, thick and pungent. You duck inside the tent. Others join you. The smoke fills the small space, inescapable. You breathe it in deeply, again and again. At first, perhaps nothing, but then, gradually, things begin to change. The grief that has been crushing you loosens its grip slightly. The world seems to soften at the edges. Colours become more vivid. Sounds seem to echo strangely. Your thoughts begin to drift, moving in unexpected directions. For a moment you feel connected to something larger than yourself, larger than your pain. Perhaps you sense the presence of the person who has died, as if they're not really gone, as if the smoke has made the barrier between this world and the next somehow permeable. This is what the archaeological evidence suggests, not a party, not an escape from reality, but a sacred ritual, a technology for managing the profound transition of death, for helping the living cope with loss, and for honouring the dead. But why this location? Why the Pamir Mountains? Researchers who studied the Jirzankel site have a theory. The high altitude and harsh conditions of the Pamir Plateau may have actually encouraged the development of high THC cannabis. Plants under environmental stress sometimes produce higher levels of secondary compounds, chemical defenses against pests, diseases, and harsh conditions. Cannabis growing at high altitude, exposed to intense UV radiation from the sun, fighting to survive in thin soil with limited water, might naturally produce more THC than its lowland cousins, or perhaps it was more intentional than that. The Pamir Mountains sat at a crucial crossroads of trade routes. People from China, from India, from Persia, all passed through these mountains. They brought goods, ideas, and plants. Different varieties of cannabis might have been traded, grown side by side, cross-pollinated. Over time, through either deliberate breeding or happy accident, varieties with higher THC content might have emerged. What we know for certain is that by 500 BCE, people in Central Asia were smoking high-potency cannabis as part of religious and funerary rituals. And this practice wasn't isolated to one cemetery on one mountaintop. Evidence of similar practices has been found across Central Asia, from Western China into Kazakhstan, Russia, and beyond. This was a widespread cultural practice, part of a shared tradition that stretched across the steppes and mountains of Inner Asia. And this brings us to the people who would make cannabis famous in the ancient Western world. The people whose practices were so exotic and shocking to the ancient Greeks that they were recorded for posterity. The people who would be remembered for thousands of years as the cannabis-smoking barbarians of the steppes. Close your eyes and imagine the vastness of the Eurasian steppe, an ocean of grass stretching from Hungary to Mongolia, thousands of miles of flat or gently rolling grassland, broken only occasionally by rivers, forests, or mountains. This was the domain of nomadic peoples, tribes who lived on horseback, following their herds, travelling with the seasons, building no permanent cities but commanding empires that could stretch farther than those of settled peoples. Among these nomads, the Scythians were legendary. They emerged onto the historical stage around 800 BCE and dominated the western steppes for the next 500 years. They were master horsemen, deadly warriors, and skilled craftsmen who worked gold into intricate art. They terrified the settled peoples of the ancient world, raiding into Persia, threatening Greece, spreading their influence from Siberia to Eastern Europe. To the Greeks, who wrote most of what we know about them, the Scythians were barbarians in the truest sense. Not stupid or uncivilized in the modern sense of the word, but foreign, exotic, living by rules and customs that seemed strange and sometimes disturbing to Mediterranean sensibilities. The Greeks admired Scythian military prowess and their beautiful goldwork, but they were also fascinated and sometimes appalled by Scythian customs. One custom in particular caught the attention of Herodotus, the Greek historian who lived in the 5th century BCE and who is often called the father of history. Herodotus travelled extensively, gathering stories and information from across the ancient world. He visited Egypt, travelled through the Middle East, and collected accounts from traders and travellers who had been even farther afield. When he compiled his great work, the Histories, around 440 BCE, he included detailed descriptions of the Scythians and their way of life, and among those descriptions was an account of a ritual so unusual that for centuries scholars doubted whether Herodotus had gotten it right. But archaeology would eventually prove him accurate in almost every detail. Herodotus describes what happened after a Scythian king died. First, there was a 40-day funeral period during which the body was carried to all the regions of the kingdom. At each stop, people mourned, cutting their hair and gashing their faces in grief. Finally, the king was buried along with enormous quantities of gold, weapons, horses, and sometimes even servants or wives who were killed to accompany him to the afterlife. But after the burial came the purification ritual, and this is where cannabis enters the story. Herodotus writes that the Scythians would set up a framework of 3 poles leaned together at the top, creating a tripod. Over this framework they stretched wool felt mats, making a small tent. Inside the tent they placed a vessel or pit containing red-hot stones. Then comes the key part. Herodotus writes, "They have hemp growing in their country, very like flax, except that the hemp is much thicker and taller. The Scythians then take the seed of this hemp, and crawling in under the mats throw it on the red-hot stones, where it smoulders and sends forth such fumes that no Greek vapour bath could surpass it. The Scythians howl in their joy at the vapour bath." For centuries, scholars debated what Herodotus really meant. Was he talking about cannabis? Was this account exaggerated or misunderstood? Some historians dismissed it as fantasy, the kind of exotic tale that ancient writers loved to tell about distant peoples. But in 1929, a Russian archaeologist named Sergei Rudenko made a discovery that vindicated Herodotus. Digging in the Pazyryk Valley in Siberia, along the border between Russia and Mongolia, Rudenko excavated a series of burial mounds called kurgans that dated to the Scythian period, roughly 5th to 2nd century BCE. The kurgans were frozen, which preserved their contents in remarkable detail. Inside one kurgan, Rudenko found exactly what Herodotus had described. There was a small tent frame made of wood, with the poles arranged to form a tripod. There was a bronze cauldron that had once contained burning material, and inside a leather bag nearby, Rudenko found cannabis seeds. But it wasn't just seeds. In the cauldron itself, mixed with the ashen residue, were burnt cannabis flowers and leaves. This was clear, physical evidence that Scythians had been burning cannabis in exactly the way Herodotus described. Not just seeds, which might have been there by accident or for food, but the flowering tops of the plant, the buds, the part that contains the highest concentration of psychoactive compounds. Rudenko found more evidence in other Scythian burials: clothing made from hemp fabric, tools for processing hemp fibre, and in one burial, a leather pouch containing cannabis seeds, hemp fibres, and what appeared to be the remains of coriander and other herbs, suggesting a mixture of plants used together for some purpose, perhaps medicinal, perhaps ritual. Later excavations of Scythian sites across the steppes found similar evidence. In 2013, archaeologists excavating a Scythian burial in the Caucasus Mountains found 2 solid gold vessels decorated with intricate scenes of Scythian life. When the black residue inside these vessels was analysed, it tested positive for both cannabis and opium. Both drugs, used together, part of a ritual that combined intoxication with religious ceremony. So Herodotus was right. The Scythians did use cannabis in their purification rituals after funerals. They did create small tents and fill them with cannabis smoke, and they did, apparently, howl with joy in the vapour. But why? What was the purpose of this ritual? Herodotus suggests it was a form of bathing, a way to cleanse themselves after the polluting contact with death. But modern scholars think it was probably more complex than that. The combination of death, mourning, intoxication, and communal experience suggests this was a way to manage grief, to ease the psychological burden of loss, and perhaps to create a sense of spiritual connection with the deceased. Think about the psychological wisdom in this practice. You've just lost your king, your leader, perhaps someone you served or loved. The 40-day mourning period has been intense, filled with public displays of grief, travelling from place to place, surrounded constantly by death and sorrow. Now the burial is complete. The body is in the ground. What do you do with the grief that still weighs on you? How do you move forward? The purification ritual offers a way. You gather with your tribe, your fellow mourners. You enter a confined space together. The cannabis smoke fills the tent and everyone breathes it together. The altered state of consciousness it creates can ease pain, soften sharp edges of emotion, create a sense of connection and communal bonding. For a little while, the grief is less crushing. For a little while, you feel something besides pain. And when you emerge from the tent, perhaps you're ready to begin the long process of moving forward. This wasn't escapism. This was therapy, practiced with sophistication by people who understood how to use plant medicines to manage difficult emotional states. The Scythians may not have had the language we use today, may not have talked about trauma and grief processing, but they clearly understood that certain plants could help people cope with psychological challenges, and cannabis wasn't the Scythians' only use for hemp. They made extensive use of hemp fibre, weaving it into clothing that could withstand the harsh conditions of steppe life. They braided hemp into ropes and lassos for herding their animals and for use in warfare. Hemp was an essential part of Scythian material culture, just as it was for settled agricultural peoples, but the Scythians' association with cannabis would become legendary in the ancient world. To Greeks and Romans, the Scythians were the exotic cannabis-smoking barbarians of the north, people whose customs were fascinating and frightening in equal measure. And through Greek and Roman writings, knowledge of cannabis use would spread throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. But Scythia wasn't the only place where ancient people were discovering the spiritual and medicinal properties of cannabis. Far to the south and east, in the Indian subcontinent, another culture was developing its own deep relationship with this remarkable plant, a relationship that would last for millennia and continues to this day. The mountains rise from the plains like gods themselves, their peaks touching the sky, their slopes clothed in forests, their heights crowned with eternal snow. The Himalayas, the roof of the world, home to some of the most extreme landscapes on earth. And in these mountains, growing wild and abundant, cannabis thrives. According to Hindu legend, it was in these mountains that the god Shiva, the great ascetic, the destroyer and transformer, discovered the properties of cannabis. The story goes that Shiva, after a particularly intense argument with his family, wandered off into the mountains alone, angry and upset. The sun beat down mercilessly. Exhausted and seeking shade, Shiva lay down beneath a leafy plant and fell asleep. When he awoke, still troubled, he noticed the leaves of the plant above him. On impulse, he plucked a few and ate them. Almost immediately he felt different. The anger dissipated. The mental turmoil that had driven him into the mountains began to quiet. He felt at peace, centered, able to see things with new clarity. The plant, Shiva realized, was a gift, and from that day forward, cannabis became his favorite food, earning him the title Lord of Bang. Now this is legend, mythology, not history in the literal sense. But like all myths, it contains deeper truths. The association between Shiva and cannabis is ancient and profound in Hindu culture. Shiva is often depicted in art with cannabis leaves, and to this day, devotees of Shiva consume bhang, a preparation made from cannabis leaves and flowers, as part of religious festivals and spiritual practices. But the history of cannabis in India goes beyond legend. The earliest written references appear in the Vedas, the ancient sacred texts of Hinduism that were compiled between roughly 2000 and 1400 BCE, making them among the oldest religious texts in the world. In the Vedas, cannabis is mentioned as one of the 5 sacred plants, alongside soma, a mysterious and possibly psychedelic plant whose exact identity has been lost to history. The Vedas refer to cannabis by its Sanskrit name, bhang. They describe it as a source of happiness and joy, a liberator that was given compassionately to humans by the gods to help us attain delight and lose fear. The Vedas say that a guardian angel resides in the bhang leaf, and that the leaf is sacred to Shiva. This isn't metaphor or poetry. This is religious doctrine, stating clearly that cannabis is a holy plant, worthy of reverence, a gift from the divine realm. In the Atharva Veda, one of the 4 main Vedic texts, cannabis is mentioned as one of the plants that release us from anxiety. This is a strikingly modern understanding of one of cannabis's primary effects. Thousands of years before we had the scientific language to describe anxiety disorders or understood the neurochemistry of how cannabis affects the brain, ancient Indian texts were recognizing that this plant could ease psychological distress. As Hinduism developed and evolved, cannabis remained central to many spiritual practices. Ayurveda, the traditional Indian system of medicine that emerged around 600 BCE, incorporated cannabis into its pharmacopoeia. Ayurvedic texts describe cannabis as useful for treating a wide range of conditions including fever, dysentery, sunstroke, digestive problems, and various pains. Cannabis preparations were considered particularly valuable for their ability to stimulate appetite and quicken digestion, but also for their effects on consciousness. In Ayurvedic theory, cannabis was believed to increase one's spiritual awareness. When used properly in the right dosage and context, it could help practitioners achieve meditative states, could aid in the pursuit of enlightenment. This wasn't seen as a shortcut or cheat, but as a legitimate tool, part of a broader spiritual practice that included meditation, yoga, fasting, and other disciplines. The association with Shiva meant that cannabis took on particular importance for certain practitioners. Sadhus, the wandering holy men of India, who have renounced worldly possessions and pleasures in pursuit of spiritual liberation, have used cannabis for centuries as part of their practice. These are men, and sometimes women, who live in forests or mountains, who own nothing but a begging bowl and perhaps a few simple clothes, who spend their days in meditation and spiritual discipline. For sadhus, cannabis serves multiple purposes. It helps suppress physical appetites, making it easier to fast and maintain celibacy. It aids in meditation, helping to quiet the constant chatter of the mind. And it creates a sense of connection with Shiva, a feeling that by consuming the god's favourite plant they are drawing closer to the divine. Even today, if you visit India, you can see sadhus smoking cannabis from chillums, traditional clay pipes, or consuming bhang, particularly during religious festivals. The preparation of bhang is itself a ritual, passed down through generations with care and reverence. Traditional bhang preparation begins with selecting the right cannabis leaves. Younger, tender leaves are preferred for their milder effects and better flavour. The leaves must be fresh, gathered in the morning when the dew has dried but before the sun grows too hot. They are washed carefully to remove dust and any insects that might be clinging to them. The actual grinding of bhang is meditative work. Traditionally it's done with a mortar and pestle, crushing the leaves slowly and methodically while reciting prayers or mantras. As the leaves break down, they release their aromatic oils, filling the air with the distinctive scent of cannabis. Water or milk is added gradually, creating a thick paste. The grinding continues for a long time, sometimes an hour or more, ensuring that the plant material is completely broken down and the cannabinoids are properly extracted into the liquid. To this basic paste, other ingredients are added. Almonds or pistachios might be ground and mixed in, adding richness and nutrition. Black pepper and cardamom provide warming spice. Rose water or sandalwood paste might be included for fragrance. Sugar or honey sweetens the mixture, making it more palatable. Saffron, if the family can afford it, adds colour and a luxurious flavour. Each family has its own recipe, variations passed down through generations, tweaked and perfected over time. Once the paste is prepared, it can be mixed with milk or yogurt to create panglassi, a cooling drink perfect for hot Indian days. Or it might be formed into small balls, pangolis, that can be stored and consumed later. Some preparations include ghee, clarified butter, which helps extract the fat-soluble cannabinoids and makes the medicine more potent. Others might include honey as a preservative and natural medicine. The serving of bhang, especially during festivals, is done with ceremony and intention. The person preparing it offers prayers to Shiva, asking for his blessing on the medicine and on those who will consume it. The bhang is served in small cups or bowls, and people receive it with both hands in a gesture of respect. Before drinking, many people will touch the cup to their forehead, acknowledging the sacred nature of what they're about to consume. The effects of traditional bhang come on slowly, often taking an hour or more to be felt. This is partly because it's consumed as food rather than smoked, and partly because traditional preparations use leaves rather than flowers, resulting in lower THC content. The experience is gentle, a gradual sense of relaxation and well-being rather than an intense intoxication. Conversation becomes easier, more flowing. Laughter comes more readily. The concerns and stresses of daily life recede slightly, creating space for spiritual contemplation or simple enjoyment of the present moment. The most important of these festivals is Mahashivaratri, the great night of Shiva, celebrated annually in February or March. On this night, devotees of Shiva stay awake, fasting and praying, visiting temples, and consuming bhang as a form of worship. The consumption of cannabis on Shivaratri isn't considered drug use in the modern sense. It's a religious sacrament, a way to honor Shiva and to experience, however briefly, a taste of the divine consciousness that Shiva represents. Temples dedicated to Shiva become centers of activity during Shivaratri. Devotees line up to offer milk and water to the Shiva Lingam, the symbolic representation of the god. They chant Om Namah Shivaya, the sacred mantra honoring Shiva. They sing bhajans, devotional songs that tell stories of Shiva's exploits and virtues. And throughout the night, bhang is consumed, creating a communal experience of altered consciousness that believers feel brings them closer to the divine. Another major festival where bhang plays a central role is Holi, the festival of colours celebrated in spring. Holi is a joyous festival marking the victory of good over evil and the arrival of spring. During Holi, people throw coloured powder at each other, dance in the streets, and often consume bhang lassi, a drink made by mixing ground cannabis leaves with milk, sugar, and spices. The bhang adds to the general atmosphere of joy and abandon that characterizes the festival. But Holi isn't just about wild celebration, it has deeper spiritual significance. The burning of Holika, a bonfire ceremony on the eve of Holi, represents the destruction of evil. The throwing of colours symbolizes the breaking down of social barriers, the recognition that beneath our superficial differences we're all the same. And the consumption of bhang is part of this levelling, this temporary suspension of normal hierarchies. During Holi, even the strictest Brahmin might accept bhang from a lower caste person. Even the most conservative elder might join in the colourful chaos with young people. The preparation for Holi begins days in advance. Families make large batches of bhang, enough to share with friends and neighbours who visit during the festival. The bhang is often prepared stronger than usual for Holi because the festival atmosphere can handle more intense effects. People expect to feel high, to laugh uncontrollably, to experience the world with childlike wonder and joy. In some regions of India, particularly in Rajasthan and parts of northern India, bhang shops operate year-round with government licenses. These shops are legal, regulated, and often have been run by the same families for generations. Walking into one of these shops is like stepping back in time. Large brass or copper vessels hold the prepared bhang paste. The shop might display pictures of Shiva, incense might be burning, and the proprietor might be chanting prayers while he works. Customers order bhang by strength, mild, medium, or strong. The shopkeeper measures out the appropriate amount of paste, mixes it with milk or yogurt, adds the spices and sweeteners, and hands it over in a disposable cup. Some customers drink it right there, standing at the shop. Others take it home or to a nearby park. The experience is social, communal. People often consume bhang in groups, sharing the experience, talking and laughing together as the effects come on. Now, it's important to understand that traditional Indian preparations of cannabis were typically made from the leaves and seeds of the plant, not the flowering buds. This resulted in a product with significantly lower THC content than what we might think of as marijuana today. Bhang, when prepared traditionally, is much milder than modern cannabis products, but it still has psychoactive effects, particularly when consumed in larger quantities. There's also karas, which is hashish made from cannabis resin. In the Himalayan regions of India, particularly in places like Manali and Malana, cannabis grows wild and abundant. Local people have been making karas for centuries, collecting the sticky resin from cannabis plants by rubbing the flowers between their hands. The resin sticks to their palms and fingers, gradually building up into a dark, sticky layer. This resin is then carefully scraped off and rolled into balls or sticks of charas. Charas is much more potent than bhang, containing higher concentrations of THC. It's typically smoked, often from a chillum, a straight conical pipe made of clay or stone. The ritual of smoking a chillum is elaborate and social. The chillum is packed with a mixture of charas and tobacco or other herbs. A cloth is wrapped around the narrow end to filter the smoke and protect the smoker's lips from heat. The chillum is held vertically, cupped in both hands, and the smoke is drawn in deeply. Before smoking, prayers are offered. Boom Shankar is a common invocation calling on Shiva. The chillum is lit and the first person takes several deep draws, holding the smoke in their lungs before exhaling slowly. Then the chillum is passed to the next person, always to the left, following the natural flow of energy according to traditional beliefs. Each person who receives the chillum acknowledges the blessing, takes their draws, and passes it on. The Brahmins, the priestly class in Hindu society, were among the primary users of bhang, particularly for religious ceremonies. But cannabis use in India wasn't limited to priests and holy men. In the medieval period, warriors would sometimes consume bhang before battle to increase courage and reduce fear of death. There are accounts of Sikh warriors under Gobind Singh consuming bhang mixed with opium before fighting, giving them legendary courage and strength. One particularly famous story tells of a battle during the time of Guru Gobind Singh in the late 17th century. The Guru's army was facing a terrifying war elephant, trained for combat and charging toward them with a sword attached to its trunk. The soldiers were on the verge of breaking and fleeing when the Guru called for a volunteer. One brave warrior stepped forward. The Guru gave him a powerful preparation of bhang and opium. The warrior consumed it, waited for the effects to take hold, then marched fearlessly toward the elephant. With incredible agility and courage enhanced by the drugs, he slipped beneath the elephant and killed it from below, turning the tide of the battle. Whether this story is literally true or embellished over time, it reflects real practices. Cannabis was used by warriors to manage fear, to enhance endurance, to maintain courage in the face of death. This wasn't seen as cheating or weakness. It was pragmatic use of available resources to accomplish necessary goals. Construction workers and labourers used bhang to help with the physical demands of their work, taking it at the end of the day to refresh themselves and fight fatigue. Farmers might use it to help endure long days of back-breaking agricultural labour. Merchants on long trading journeys might use it to ease the monotony of travel. This wasn't seen as problematic or morally wrong. Cannabis was simply one of many plants that nature provided for human use. The medical use of cannabis in Ayurveda, India's traditional medical system, was sophisticated and extensive. Ayurvedic texts describe cannabis as having heating properties, making it useful for conditions caused by cold or dampness. It was prescribed for digestive problems, for pain, for insomnia, for anxiety. Different preparations were used for different conditions. Cannabis mixed with milk was cooling and nourishing. Cannabis mixed with wine was heating and stimulating. Cannabis mixed with honey was used for lung conditions. Ayurvedic physicians understood that cannabis affected different people differently, depending on their dosha, their constitutional type. Vata types, prone to anxiety and restlessness, might benefit from small amounts of cannabis to calm the mind. Pitta types, prone to anger and inflammation, needed to be careful with cannabis as it could increase heat. Kapha types, prone to lethargy and congestion, might find cannabis too sedating. This personalized approach to cannabis medicine was far more sophisticated than the one-size-fits-all approach common in modern medicine. Even today, despite India's official adoption of international drug control treaties in the late 20th century, cannabis remains part of Indian culture in ways that would be unthinkable in most other countries. Bhang is still legal in India when made from leaves and seeds rather than flowers. Government-licensed bhang shops exist in many cities, particularly in places with strong Shiva worship traditions like Varanasi, one of Hinduism's holiest cities. In Varanasi, along the Ghats, the stone steps leading down to the sacred Ganges River, you can watch men preparing bhang using methods that haven't changed significantly in centuries. They begin with prayers, acknowledging Shiva and asking for his blessing. They grind the cannabis leaves with other ingredients, mixing everything with devotion and care. And throughout the day, pilgrims, sadhus, and regular citizens come to purchase bhang, to drink it as part of their spiritual practice, or simply as a way to relax and find peace in a chaotic world. This continuity, this unbroken tradition stretching back thousands of years, is remarkable. In most of the world, cannabis use was disrupted by 20th century prohibition. Ancient traditions were broken, knowledge was lost, practices were criminalized. But in India, despite the complications of colonial rule and modern drug laws, the sacred status of cannabis has been maintained. Shiva is still the lord of bhang, the Vedas are still read and respected, and millions of Hindus still view cannabis not as a drug of abuse, but as a gift from the gods, a sacred plant that can help humans connect with the divine. But India wasn't the only ancient civilization to incorporate cannabis into its religious and medical practices. Thousands of miles to the west along the banks of the Nile River, another great civilization was discovering its own uses for this versatile plant. The desert stretches in all directions, endless sand under an unforgiving sun. But here, where the Nile River flows north toward the Mediterranean, life flourishes. Green banks thick with papyrus, fields of wheat and barley, date palms swaying in the breeze. And among the crops, among the plants cultivated for food and medicine and craft, cannabis grew. We know cannabis was present in ancient Egypt from multiple lines of evidence. Pollen grains identified as cannabis have been found in archaeological sites dating back to pre-dynastic times, around 3500 BCE or earlier. This doesn't necessarily prove cultivation. Pollen can travel on the wind from wild plants, but it demonstrates the plant's presence in the region. More concrete evidence comes from the mummies themselves. When the mummy of Pharaoh Ramesses II was examined in the 1970s and 1980s, researchers found something unexpected. Pollen grains of cannabis, embedded in the mummy's wrappings and preserved through 3,000 years. Ramesses II died in 1213 BCE during Egypt's 19th dynasty, at the height of Egyptian power and culture. He was one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, ruling for 67 years, building massive monuments, winning military victories, and embodying the divine power of kingship. And his mummy contained cannabis. This single discovery sparked enormous interest and debate. Was this evidence of cannabis use by the pharaoh himself? Or could it have been contamination, pollen that blew in during the mummification process or later? Further research on other mummies from the same period found similar results. Multiple royal mummies showed traces of cannabis pollen, and in some cases, researchers claimed to find THC in mummified tissue, though these findings have been disputed. What we know with more certainty comes from Egyptian medical texts. The most famous of these is the Ebers Papyrus, a medical document dating to around 1550 BCE. This is one of the oldest and most important medical texts from ancient Egypt, containing hundreds of remedies and treatments for various conditions. And among these remedies, cannabis appears multiple times. One prescription from the Ebers Papyrus describes treating inflammation of the eyes, possibly glaucoma. The treatment involves grinding celery and cannabis together, letting the mixture sit in the dew overnight, and then washing the patient's eyes with it in the morning. Remarkably, modern research has confirmed that cannabis can indeed reduce intraocular pressure, one of the primary problems in glaucoma. The ancient Egyptians didn't understand the mechanism, but they had discovered through trial and error that cannabis could help with certain eye conditions. Another ancient Egyptian medical text, the Ramesseum Papyri, dating to around 1700 BCE, contains similar references to cannabis. These texts describe using cannabis for various purposes, including treating inflammation, soothing pain, and even as a component in treatments for what we might now call gynecological issues. One rather intimate prescription describes using cannabis ground in honey and inserted into the vagina as a treatment for various feminine complaints. Egyptian physicians also used cannabis in preparations for enemas, for treating hemorrhoids, and for cooling fever. They mixed it with other herbs and substances, creating complex formulas that addressed multiple symptoms simultaneously. This was sophisticated medicine, not folk remedies stumbled upon by accident, but systematic treatments developed and refined over centuries. But cannabis in Egypt wasn't only medicine, it may also have played a role in religious practices. The goddess Seshat, patroness of writing, libraries and record-keeping, is sometimes depicted in Egyptian art with a 7-pointed star-like symbol above her head. Some researchers have argued that this symbol represents a cannabis leaf, suggesting an association between the plant and wisdom or divine knowledge. This interpretation is controversial and not all Egyptologists accept it, but it hints at the possibility that cannabis had spiritual significance beyond its medical uses. The presence of cannabis in royal mummies raises another possibility. Were pharaohs and other elites using cannabis for its psychoactive effects, perhaps as part of funerary preparations or religious rituals? In some of the mummies studied, researchers claim to find THC not just on the surface, but in internal tissues, particularly in the lungs, suggesting the cannabis had been smoked or inhaled before death. If true, this would indicate that ancient Egyptians understood and used the psychoactive properties of cannabis, not just its fiber and medicinal applications. The evidence is intriguing but not conclusive. What we can say with confidence is that cannabis was known, available and used in ancient Egypt for at least 3,000 years. It appears in medical texts, its pollen appears in archaeological contexts, and traces of it appear in the most sacred and carefully preserved objects of Egyptian culture, the mummified bodies of the pharaohs themselves. Egyptian knowledge of cannabis may have been influenced by trade contacts. Egypt sat at a crucial crossroads, connected by trade routes to sub-Saharan Africa, to the Middle East, and to the Mediterranean world. Cannabis from Central Asia or India could have reached Egypt through these trade networks, bringing with it knowledge of the plant's properties and uses. By the time the Roman Empire conquered Egypt in the 1st century BCE, cannabis was well established in Egyptian culture. Roman physicians working in Egypt would have been exposed to Egyptian medical knowledge, including the use of cannabis. And through the Romans, this knowledge would eventually spread throughout the Mediterranean world and into Europe. But before we follow that path westward, we need to look at one more crucial piece of the ancient cannabis story. We need to understand how cannabis spread from its origins in Central Asia to become a truly global plant, carried along ancient trade routes by merchants, missionaries, and migrants. We need to look at the Silk Road, that legendary network of routes that connected east and west for thousands of years. Imagine standing at the edge of an oasis somewhere in the vast deserts of Central Asia. Behind you, the mountains you've just crossed loom against the sky. Before you, more desert stretches toward distant horizons. But here, at this moment, at this particular oasis, the world comes together. Chinese merchants are here, their camels loaded with silk and porcelain. Persian traders have brought spices and dyes from the Middle East. Indians offer cotton textiles and precious stones. There are Central Asian nomads with horses and felt. Greek artisans carrying metalwork. Everyone is buying, selling, trading, exchanging not just goods but ideas, techniques, beliefs and plants. This is the Silk Road, though that name is a modern invention. The people who travelled these routes never called them that. They were simply the roads, the paths that connected the known world, that made trade and cultural exchange possible across the vast distances of Asia. And along these roads, cannabis travelled. Hemp fibre and rope went from China westward, valued for its strength and durability. Cannabis seeds moved as trade goods, food for both humans and animals. But more importantly, knowledge travelled. Knowledge about which varieties of cannabis produced the best fibre, which varieties were good for oil, and which varieties, when dried and burned, created smoke that could alter consciousness and heal disease. The Silk Road wasn't really a single road. It was a complex network of routes, constantly shifting based on political conditions, weather, and local circumstances. But certain cities and regions served as crucial hubs, places where merchants from different regions met and exchanged goods. And in many of these hubs, cannabis use became established. One particularly important region was Bactria, roughly corresponding to parts of modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. Bactria sat at the crossroads of multiple trade routes, and it was fertile ground for agriculture. Cannabis grew well there, and Bactrian cannabis developed a reputation for quality. Persian and later Islamic writers would describe Bactrian cannabis as particularly potent, especially varieties grown in certain valleys known for their ideal growing conditions. In Bactria and neighbouring regions, Zoroastrianism was the dominant religion for many centuries. Zoroastrianism, one of the world's oldest continuously practiced religions, has a complex liturgy involving the preparation and consumption of sacred drinks called haoma. The exact composition of haoma has been debated for centuries, but some researchers believe cannabis may have been one of the ingredients, particularly in later periods, after the original plants used in the earliest haoma preparations became unavailable or extinct. Whether or not cannabis was part of the original Zoroastrian haoma, we know that by the early medieval period, cannabis was being widely used in the regions where Zoroastrianism had been dominant. And as Islam spread through these same regions in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, cannabis use continued, though it would take on new forms and new controversies. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to the ancient period and follow cannabis as it spread westward from the Middle East into the Mediterranean world. Greek and Roman writers mention cannabis, though usually in passing and often confusing it with other plants. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century CE, describes cannabis in his pharmacological work, noting both its use for making rope and its medicinal properties. He mentions that cannabis seeds, when consumed, are difficult to digest but can help with various complaints. Galen, another Greek physician working in the 2nd century CE, mentions cannabis as well, describing it as a plant that can produce a kind of euphoria if consumed in large quantities but can also cause headaches. His description suggests he understood that cannabis had psychoactive effects, though he doesn't seem to have considered these effects particularly valuable or interesting. The Romans used hemp fibre extensively for ship rigging and rope, as hemp rope was superior to other materials for maritime use. Roman armies may have cultivated hemp in their military colonies throughout Europe, spreading the plant to regions where it hadn't grown before. Roman physicians prescribed cannabis for various ailments, though it never became as central to Greco-Roman medicine as it was in Indian Ayurveda or Chinese traditional medicine. Cannabis also reached Africa during this period, spreading south from Egypt through trade contacts. Exactly when and how cannabis spread through sub-Saharan Africa is unclear, but by the medieval period, cannabis use was established in various African cultures, often with spiritual or medicinal significance. What's remarkable about this ancient spread of cannabis is how the plant was adapted to different cultural contexts. In China, it was valued primarily for fiber, seeds, and oil, with medical use as a secondary application. In India, the emphasis was on spiritual and religious uses, with cannabis seen as a divine gift that could facilitate connection with higher consciousness. In Egypt and the Middle East, medical applications seem to have been most prominent. Among the Scythians and other Central Asian nomads, ritual and shamanic uses dominated. These different emphases weren't mutually exclusive. A culture might use hemp for fiber and cannabis for medicine simultaneously. But each culture developed its own relationship with the plant, its own traditions and knowledge, its own ways of preparing and consuming it. This diversity of use continued through the medieval period and into the early modern era. Cannabis never disappeared from human culture, never fell out of use, even as empires rose and fell, religions spread and competed, and human civilization went through profound transformations. But in the medieval period, cannabis would become entangled with new controversies, particularly in the Islamic world, where a new form of cannabis preparation would emerge that would both fascinate and trouble religious authorities for centuries to come. The year is 1090 CE. High in the mountains of northern Iran, a fortress called Alamut perches on a rocky peak like an eagle's nest. This is the stronghold of Hassani Saba, leader of a secretive Islamic sect called the Nizari Ismailis, or as their enemies called them, the Assassins. Legend would later claim that Hassan kept his followers loyal by giving them hashish, leading them to a secret garden where they experienced paradise, then telling them they could only return to that blissful state by obeying his commands to kill his enemies. This story is almost certainly false, a legend created by hostile sources to demonize a religious sect that threatened the established order. But it reflects a real phenomenon. By the medieval period, hashish, concentrated cannabis resin, had become a significant presence in the Islamic world, and it was controversial. The rise of hashish, as opposed to other forms of cannabis use, seems to have occurred somewhere around the 10th or 11th century CE, though the exact timing and location are debated. Hashish is made by collecting the resinous trichomes from cannabis flowers, essentially concentrating the THC and other cannabinoids into a product that's far more potent than dried cannabis flowers alone. The production of hashish may have originated in Central Asia or Persia, regions where high-quality cannabis was abundant and where techniques for processing plants into concentrated forms were well established. Hashish could be stored for long periods without degrading, could be transported easily, and required only small amounts to produce effects. For traders moving along the Silk Road or through desert regions, hashish was a practical form in which to carry cannabis. But hashish created problems that earlier forms of cannabis hadn't. When cannabis is consumed as leaves or mildly potent flowers, the effects are relatively subtle, especially when mixed with other herbs or consumed in small amounts. Hashish, by contrast, is powerfully intoxicating. Users of hashish could become profoundly altered, unable to function normally, experiencing effects that could be overwhelming or frightening. Islamic religious scholars debated whether cannabis use was permissible under Islamic law. The Quran explicitly forbids khamr, usually translated as wine but understood more broadly to mean any intoxicating substance. However, cannabis isn't mentioned specifically in the Quran, and early Islamic legal scholars had to determine whether the ban on intoxicants applied to cannabis as well. The consensus that eventually emerged was nuanced. Many Islamic scholars ruled that cannabis was haram, forbidden when used for intoxication. However, using hemp fiber or hemp seeds for food was permissible, and medical use of cannabis under a physician's direction might be allowed in some circumstances. But recreational use of hashish for the purpose of getting high was generally condemned. Despite these religious prohibitions, hashish use spread throughout the Islamic world during the medieval period. It was particularly popular among certain Sufi orders, mystical Islamic groups who sought direct experience of the divine through meditation, music, dancing, and sometimes the use of mind-altering substances. For some Sufis, hashish was a tool for achieving spiritual states, a way to quiet the rational mind and open oneself to divine presence. Sufi poets wrote extensively about hashish, often in coded language that allowed them to discuss something officially forbidden. The great Persian poets like Rumi and Hafez wrote verses that can be read as references to hashish, though they often used wine as a more acceptable metaphor for intoxication and spiritual ecstasy. Whether these poets actually used hashish themselves or were simply using it as a literary device remains debated. Outside of mystical circles, hashish use spread among various segments of society. Labourers might use it to ease the physical demands of their work. Soldiers sometimes used it, though this was controversial. Urban merchants and craftsmen might use it recreationally. And in certain cities, hashish dens emerged where people could gather to consume hashish in a social setting, similar to wine houses or coffee houses. But hashish also developed a sinister reputation. Stories circulated about hashish users committing crimes, falling into madness, or ruining their lives through excessive consumption. These stories often had a moral tone, warning against the dangers of intoxication and the importance of maintaining sobriety and reason. Whether these stories reflected real patterns of problematic use or were exaggerated moralizing tales is difficult to determine from this distance. What we can say is that by the 13th century, hashish had become enough of a social concern that some Islamic rulers began trying to suppress it. In 1253 CE, according to some accounts, the ruler of Cairo ordered the destruction of hemp fields and the burning of stored hashish. This may be one of the first documented cases of cannabis prohibition in human history. But such prohibitions were rarely effective for long. The plant was too easy to grow, too embedded in trade networks, too useful in too many ways to be fully suppressed. Meanwhile, in other parts of the Islamic world, cannabis continued to be valued for fiber and medical uses without significant controversy. In Morocco, in Central Asia, in the regions that would later become Afghanistan and Pakistan, cannabis cultivation continued as it had for centuries, with hashish production becoming a minor industry in some regions. It's worth noting that before tobacco was introduced to the Old World from the Americas in the 16th century, cannabis and hashish were typically consumed as edibles or in drinks, not smoked. Smoking as a method of consuming substances wasn't unknown. Various plants were burned and their smoke inhaled in religious rituals, but it wasn't a common practice for recreational or medical use. The introduction of tobacco and the smoking apparatus that came with it would transform how people used cannabis, making smoking the preferred method in many cultures. But that transformation was still centuries away. For now, in the medieval Islamic world, cannabis existed in a complex space, condemned by religious authorities but tolerated in practice, prohibited by some rulers but cultivated and used widely, associated with both spiritual seekers and social problems. This ambivalence would continue for centuries, and in some ways it persists to this day in predominantly Islamic countries, where cannabis laws remain strict even as use continues in various forms. From the Islamic world, knowledge of cannabis would eventually reach medieval Europe, where it would be incorporated into European herbal medicine, and where hemp cultivation would become economically important for the growing maritime powers. The rigging of a ship creaks and groans as wind fills the sails. Canvas billows, stretched tight, pulling the vessel forward across blue water. But these aren't ordinary sails. They're made from hemp, woven from the fibers of cannabis plants, and the ropes that control these sails, that hold the ship together, that make sailing possible, those too are made from hemp. Without hemp, the age of exploration, the age of sailing ships that would transform the world, would have been impossible. Hemp cultivation reached Europe relatively early, probably brought by the Scythians or other Central Asian peoples during the Bronze Age. Archaeological evidence shows hemp fiber in Europe by around 1000 BCE, and by the Roman period, hemp cultivation was well established across southern Europe. The Romans valued hemp highly for rope and textiles, and Roman agricultural writers provided detailed instructions for growing the crop. After the fall of the Roman Empire, hemp cultivation continued in Europe, spreading northward as agriculture expanded. Medieval European farmers grew hemp for local use, spinning the fiber into thread, weaving it into rough cloth, twisting it into rope. Hemp fabric wasn't as fine as linen or wool, but it was durable and relatively inexpensive, making it practical for common people's clothing and for industrial applications. But it was the age of exploration, beginning in the 15th century, that made hemp economically crucial. As European nations began building large sailing ships capable of crossing oceans, they discovered that hemp was the best material for ship rigging. Hemp rope was strong, resistant to rot from seawater, and could be produced in the long lengths needed for ships' rigging. Hemp sails, though not as fine as linen, were more durable and could withstand the harsh conditions of ocean voyages. The demand for hemp became enormous. A single large sailing ship required tons of hemp rope and canvas. Navies needed fleets of such ships. Every maritime nation needed vast quantities of hemp, and this need drove agricultural policy. England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, all the major maritime powers encouraged or required farmers to grow hemp. In some cases, farmers were legally obligated to devote a portion of their land to hemp cultivation. This was purely industrial hemp cultivated for fiber, with no interest in psychoactive properties. The varieties of cannabis grown in Europe for rope and sail making had very low THC content. They were selected over generations for tall stalks with long fibers, not for resinous flowers. You could smoke a ship's worth of hemp rope and feel nothing but smoke inhalation. But Europeans weren't completely ignorant of cannabis's medicinal and psychoactive properties. Medieval and Renaissance herbal texts mention cannabis, usually under its Latin name Cannabis sativa, or various vernacular names like hemp. These texts describe medical uses similar to those found in ancient texts: pain relief, treatment of inflammation, sedative properties. However, cannabis never became particularly important in European medicine the way it was in India or China. European physicians had access to opium poppies, which provided stronger pain relief. They had various local plants for treating inflammation and promoting sleep. Cannabis was mentioned in medical texts, but it was far from a commonly prescribed medicine. This would change, however, in the 19th century, when European colonial powers would encounter cannabis-using cultures in their colonies and would bring back new knowledge and new attitudes about the plant. But before we reach that point, we need to follow cannabis to a new continent, a place where it would be cultivated extensively, but where its psychoactive properties would be largely forgotten, at least by the dominant culture. We need to cross the Atlantic to the Americas. The Jamestown Colony, Virginia, 1611. English settlers are struggling to survive in their new home. Many are dying from disease, starvation, and conflicts with native peoples. The colony is on the verge of collapse. But among the crops the settlers are planting, trying desperately to find something that will grow, something that can be sold back to England to justify the colony's existence, is hemp. Hemp was one of the first crops planted by European colonists in North America. The plant grew well in Virginia's climate, and the colonists knew there was demand back in England for hemp fibre. The Virginia Company, which sponsored the colony, encouraged hemp cultivation, and later colonial governments would sometimes require farmers to grow hemp. Throughout the American colonial period, hemp was an important agricultural crop. It was grown for rope and fabric, both for local use and for export. Many of the founding fathers grew hemp, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Washington's farm diaries contain numerous references to hemp cultivation, noting when it was planted, when it was harvested, how much fiber was produced. But here's what's interesting. There's no evidence that the founding fathers or any of the colonial-era farmers growing hemp had any interest in or knowledge of its psychoactive properties. The hemp grown in colonial America was industrial hemp, low in THC, cultivated solely for fiber. The cultural knowledge of cannabis as a psychoactive or medicinal plant hadn't made the journey across the Atlantic with the European settlers. This is a crucial point to understand. For most of American history, until the early 20th century, when Americans said hemp, they meant fiber. The plant they were talking about was botanically cannabis, but it was a specific type of cannabis bred for tall stalks and long fibers, not for THC production. The idea that hemp might be smoked or consumed for its effects was completely foreign to mainstream American culture. Cannabis as a medicine did eventually reach America, but through different channels. In the mid-19th century, European physicians who had been working in British India returned home with knowledge of Indian cannabis preparations. They began experimenting with cannabis extracts, creating tinctures and pills that were prescribed for various conditions. In 1839, an Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy published a detailed paper on his experiences using cannabis medicine while working in India. O'Shaughnessy had observed Indian physicians using cannabis and had conducted his own experiments, treating patients with various conditions including tetanus, rabies, rheumatism, and cholera. He found cannabis extracts to be particularly valuable as a pain reliever and muscle relaxant. O'Shaughnessy's work generated significant interest in Europe and America. Pharmaceutical companies began producing cannabis extracts, which were sold in pharmacies as patent medicines. These were legal, over-the-counter products marketed for various conditions. The labels might claim the medicine was good for nervous disorders, pain relief, sleep aid, or other vague conditions that were common in 19th century patent medicine advertising. Cannabis tinctures and extracts remained available in American pharmacies well into the early 20th century. They were never hugely popular. Opium-based medicines were more powerful and probably more effective for severe pain, but cannabis medicines were an established part of the medical landscape. They appeared in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official listing of approved medicines, from 1850 until 1942, but almost no one in America was smoking cannabis recreationally. The smoking method hadn't reached America yet, and the idea of smoking hemp for pleasure would have seemed bizarre to most Americans in the 19th century. Cannabis was medicine, sold in bottles at the pharmacy, or it was hemp, an agricultural crop grown for fibre. These were two separate things in the American mind, barely connected to each other. This would begin to change at the turn of the 20th century, with immigration from Mexico. And this change, this introduction of cannabis smoking to American culture, would set in motion a cascade of events that would transform cannabis from an unremarkable plant into perhaps the most controversial substance in American history. Before we reach the darkness of Prohibition, we need to understand something that came before, something that happened in smoky rooms where jazz musicians gathered, in underground clubs during the Prohibition era, in a subculture that existed in the shadows of respectable society. We need to talk about how cannabis smoking first took root in American culture, not through Mexican immigration alone, but through a complex interchange between cultures, between black musicians and bohemian artists, between the margins and the mainstream. The 1920s were a contradictory time in America. Alcohol was prohibited, banned by constitutional amendment, supposedly to create a more moral, productive society. But Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking. It just drove alcohol underground, into speakeasies and illegal distilleries, creating a vast criminal enterprise that would make fortunes for gangsters and corrupt politicians. And in those same underground spaces where illegal alcohol flowed, another substance was beginning to make its presence felt. Cannabis in the 1920s and 1930s was legal in most of the United States, at least at the federal level. But it existed in a strange cultural space. The industrial hemp industry was legitimate and unremarkable. Medical cannabis preparations could be purchased at pharmacies. But recreational cannabis smoking was associated with groups that mainstream white America viewed with suspicion or outright hostility. Black people, Mexican immigrants, and jazz musicians. Jazz itself was controversial. To many white Americans, jazz represented everything threatening about modernity and racial mixing. It was black music, born in the brothels and dance halls of New Orleans, played by musicians who often used drugs and alcohol, who lived unconventional lives, who rejected the strictures of respectable society. And many of these musicians smoked cannabis, which they called by various slang names: tea, gauge, reefer, muggles. The connection between jazz and cannabis ran deep, Musicians claimed that cannabis enhanced their creativity, allowed them to hear music differently, to improvise in ways that wouldn't occur to them sober. Whether this was objectively true or not, the belief was widespread. Louis Armstrong, one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time, was a lifelong cannabis user. In 1929, he recorded a song called Muggles, the slang term for cannabis cigarettes. The song's title wasn't subtle. Everyone in the jazz world knew what Muggles meant. Armstrong wasn't alone. Mez Mesro, a white jazz musician who played clarinet with black musicians in Chicago and New York, became so associated with high-quality cannabis that his nickname became a synonym for the drug. Mez meant good cannabis. Mesro wrote about cannabis extensively in his autobiography, describing it as a gift, something that enhanced life and art, that brought people together across racial lines in a segregated society. These jazz musicians gathered in places called tea pads, apartments or small clubs where people could smoke cannabis in relative safety. Tea pads were particularly common in Harlem during the 1920s and 1930s. They weren't like modern bars or clubs. They were typically just someone's apartment, furnished with cushions and low lights, where people could come, pay a small fee, and smoke cannabis while listening to music or talking. Tea pads were integrated spaces, one of the few places in segregated America where black and white people might mingle freely, united by their appreciation for jazz and cannabis. This integration was itself threatening to many white Americans. One of the recurring themes in anti-cannabis propaganda would be the claim that cannabis caused racial mixing, that white women who used cannabis would be led into sexual relationships with black men. This wasn't about the drug. It was about maintaining racial hierarchy in a society where some people were beginning to question whether that hierarchy was legitimate or moral. The teapad culture existed largely beneath the notice of mainstream society through the 1920s and into the 1930s. Police occasionally raided these establishments, but enforcement was sporadic and often focused more on gambling or alcohol violations than on cannabis itself. Cannabis wasn't yet seen as a major threat. It was associated with marginal people, but it wasn't the subject of major moral panic the way alcohol was. But this would change. As the Great Depression deepened in the 1930s, as unemployment soared and anxiety about the future intensified, scapegoating of minorities increased. Mexican immigrants, who had been welcomed or at least tolerated when the economy was good, suddenly became targets. They were accused of taking jobs from real Americans, of bringing crime and disease, and of introducing marijuana smoking to innocent white youth. The cultural stage was being set for prohibition. Cannabis was being associated in the public mind with threatening outsiders, Mexicans, black people, jazz musicians, bohemians, all the groups that respectable white America already feared or despised. And into this volatile mixture stepped Harry Anslinger, a man who would weaponize these prejudices to justify a war on a plant that humans had used safely for thousands of years. Everything changed with the Mexican Revolution. Starting in 1910, political turmoil in Mexico drove tens of thousands of refugees north across the border into the United States. These refugees settled primarily in Texas and the Southwest, bringing with them their language, their culture, and their traditions. And among those traditions was the practice of smoking cannabis, which they called by its Spanish name, marijuana. The cannabis being smoked by Mexican immigrants wasn't fundamentally different from the hemp being grown by American farmers. It was the same plant, Cannabis sativa, though perhaps varieties with slightly higher THC content. But the method of use was entirely different. Instead of processing the stalks for fiber or extracting medicine from the plant, Mexican users dried the flowers and leaves, rolled them into cigarettes, and smoked them for their intoxicating effects. This was completely new to American culture, and it arrived at a deeply unfortunate moment in American history, a moment of intense xenophobia, nativism, and racial anxiety. The early 20th century saw massive immigration to the United States from southern and eastern Europe, from Asia, from Mexico. Many white Americans felt threatened by these new arrivals, worried that they would change American culture, take jobs, commit crimes, intermarry with whites, and somehow pollute the racial stock. These anxious racist fears would become entangled with attitudes toward cannabis in ways that would shape American drug policy for the next century. It started in the Southwest, in border states that saw the largest influx of Mexican immigrants. As early as 1914, El Paso, Texas, passed a local ordinance banning cannabis. The ban wasn't based on any medical or scientific evidence about the drug's dangers. It was explicitly aimed at Mexican immigrants, providing a pretext for police to harass and control a population that many white Texans viewed as undesirable. Over the next decade, more and more states passed anti-cannabis laws, particularly in the West and Southwest. The laws often used the Spanish term marijuana rather than cannabis, or hemp, emphasizing the drug's foreign Mexican character. Newspapers and politicians began spreading wild stories about the supposed dangers of marijuana, claiming it caused violence, insanity, and moral degradation. These stories were almost entirely fabricated or grossly exaggerated. But they served a purpose. They justified discrimination against Mexican immigrants and gave authorities legal tools to control unwanted populations. If you could arrest someone for possessing marijuana, you didn't need to bother with actual crimes. The possession itself became the crime. But state-level prohibition, while significant, wasn't as consequential as what would happen at the federal level. And for that story, we need to talk about a man named Harry Jacob Anslinger. Anslinger was appointed the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. His job was to enforce federal drug laws, primarily targeting heroin and cocaine. But in 1933, prohibition ended, alcohol became legal again, and Anslinger suddenly found himself with a bureaucracy to run but fewer obvious targets. He needed a new menace to justify his bureau's existence and his own importance. He found that menace in cannabis, or as he insisted on calling it, marijuana. And the campaign Anslinger waged against cannabis over the next 3 decades was explicitly, openly racist. He made no attempt to hide the racial motivations behind his crusade. His own statements, preserved in letters and memos and newspaper articles, reveal a man who believed that cannabis was dangerous primarily because of who was using it: Mexicans, black people, and jazz musicians. Some of Anslinger's statements are so shocking they almost seem like parody. Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races. Marijuana causes white women to seek sexual relations with Negroes. These are direct quotes, documented in multiple sources, statements made publicly by the head of federal drug enforcement. Anslinger's campaign weaponized racism to generate fear about cannabis. He collected anecdotal stories about crimes allegedly committed under the influence of marijuana and sent them to newspapers, encouraging sensationalistic coverage. He cherry-picked quotes from doctors, sometimes distorting their statements to suggest that cannabis was far more dangerous than medical evidence actually indicated. He claimed that marijuana led to violence, insanity, and death. Despite having no scientific data to support these claims, the propaganda campaign worked. By the mid-1930s, much of the American public believed that marijuana was a dangerous drug that turned users into violent criminals and addicts. The fact that cannabis had been used medicinally for decades with no similar concerns was conveniently forgotten. The fact that hemp had been cultivated in America since colonial times was irrelevant. Cannabis, now rebranded as marijuana to emphasize its foreignness, had been successfully demonized. In 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which didn't technically ban cannabis, but imposed such heavy taxes and bureaucratic requirements on anyone selling or possessing it that it became effectively illegal. No medical or scientific experts testified in favor of the bill. The American Medical Association actually opposed it, arguing that cannabis had legitimate medical uses and that prohibition would interfere with medical research and practice. But the AMA's objections were brushed aside and the bill passed easily. The Marijuana Tax Act was eventually declared unconstitutional in 1969, but by then it didn't matter. In 1970, Congress passed the Controlled Substances Act, which classified cannabis as a Schedule I drug, the most restrictive category. Schedule I drugs are defined as having high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety for use under medical supervision. Cannabis was placed in the same category as heroin, LSD, and peyote, considered more dangerous than cocaine or methamphetamine, which were classified as Schedule II. This classification was not based on scientific evidence. No comprehensive scientific review of cannabis was conducted before it was placed in Schedule I. Medical experts were not consulted. It was a political decision, driven by the same fears and prejudices that had motivated prohibition in the first place. And this is where we need to talk about something deeply uncomfortable: the racial disparities in enforcement of cannabis laws. From the beginning of federal prohibition to the present day, Black Americans have been arrested for cannabis offenses at dramatically higher rates than white Americans, despite roughly equal rates of use across racial groups. In some jurisdictions, Black people have been arrested for cannabis possession at rates 8, 10, even 15 times higher than whites. This disparity isn't accidental. It's not an unfortunate side effect of neutral laws. The laws themselves were designed from their inception to target and control minority populations. Anslinger said so explicitly. His successors may have used less overtly racist language, but the effect has been the same. Cannabis prohibition has been a tool of racial control and oppression for nearly a century. The war on drugs, declared by Richard Nixon in 1971 and escalated by Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, amplified these effects. Mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, including cannabis, led to mass incarceration on a scale unprecedented in human history. The United States came to have the highest incarceration rate in the world, and a huge proportion of those imprisoned were there for drug offenses, and a disproportionate number of those drug offenders were Black and Hispanic men arrested for cannabis. Lives were destroyed, families were torn apart, communities were devastated, all in the name of fighting a drug that, as we've seen, had been used safely by humans for thousands of years, that had been considered a medicine by physicians for decades, and that even by the government's own later research was far less dangerous than alcohol or tobacco, both of which remained legal. The story of cannabis prohibition is, ultimately, a story about racism, about power, about how fear and prejudice can be weaponized to justify oppression. It's a story about how a plant that had served humanity for 10,000 years could be transformed through propaganda and lies into a symbol of moral panic. And it's a story about the tremendous human cost of bad drug policy. But it's not where our story ends. Because even as the war on drugs raged, even as millions were arrested and imprisoned, a counter-movement was growing. People were beginning to question the official narrative about cannabis. Scientists were conducting research that contradicted government claims. Patients were discovering that cannabis could help with conditions that prescription drugs couldn't effectively treat. And gradually, slowly, the tide began to turn. The year is 1965, and something new is stirring in America. A generation born during or after World War II is coming of age, and many of them are profoundly dissatisfied with the world their parents built. The prosperity of the post-war years hasn't brought happiness, just conformity and materialism. The Cold War threatens nuclear annihilation. Racial segregation persists despite claims of American freedom and equality. And increasingly, young Americans are being sent to die in a war in Vietnam that many don't understand and fewer believe in, out of this dissatisfaction, out of this sense that something fundamental is wrong with American society, emerges the counterculture. And cannabis, prohibited and demonized for decades, becomes one of the symbols of this new movement. But to understand the counterculture of the 1960s, we need to back up slightly to the 1950s, to a group of writers and artists who laid the groundwork. They called themselves the Beat Generation, though others called them beatniks, often with derision. Writers like Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs rejected the conformity and materialism of 1950s America. They wrote poetry and novels that celebrated spontaneity, spirituality, sexual freedom, and yes, drug use. The Beats were influenced by jazz culture, by black musicians and the cannabis-smoking teapad scene. They adopted many of the same attitudes and practices, including cannabis use. Ginsberg's famous poem, Howl, published in 1956, contains references to drug use and sexual experiences that shocked mainstream America. The poem was actually prosecuted for obscenity, though the publisher was eventually acquitted. The Beats weren't a mass movement. They were a small group of intellectuals and artists, mostly centered in New York's Greenwich Village and San Francisco's North Beach. But their ideas spread, particularly to college students and young artists. They popularized the idea that one could and should reject mainstream values, that consciousness could be expanded through drugs and spiritual practices, that conformity was a kind of death. By the early 1960s, the beat movement was fading, but something new was emerging from it. In San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, young people were gathering in increasing numbers. They wore colourful clothes, grew their hair long, listened to a new kind of music that blended rock, folk, and psychedelic sounds. They experimented with LSD, which was still legal until 1966, and they smoked cannabis, lots of cannabis, openly and defiantly. The word hippie was coined to describe these young people. It derived from hipster, the term that had been used for jazz aficionados and beats. But hippies were something different from their beat predecessors. The Beats had been intellectual, literary, often dark in their outlook. Hippies were more optimistic, more communal, more focused on peace and love and transformation of society through cultural change rather than through literature alone. And cannabis was central to hippie culture in a way it hadn't been for the Beats. For hippies, cannabis wasn't just something you did occasionally. It was a sacrament, a tool for consciousness expansion, a way to opt out of straight society's values. Smoking cannabis together was a bonding ritual, a way to create community and signal that you were part of the counterculture. The hippie movement exploded into public consciousness in 1967, the so-called Summer of Love. Tens of thousands of young people descended on San Francisco, many with nowhere to live, no money, no plan beyond being part of something new and exciting. The Haight-Ashbury became overcrowded, overwhelmed. Local activists tried to provide food and medical care for the influx of young people, many of whom were naive about the realities of living on the streets. But despite the difficulties, despite the media sensationalism and the inevitable exploitation, something real was happening. A genuine youth movement was emerging that questioned fundamental assumptions of American society. Why should young men go to war in Vietnam? Why should material success be the measure of a life well lived? Why should drugs be illegal if they expanded consciousness and brought peace and insight? Why should sexual behavior be constrained by old puritanical rules? Why couldn't people just be free? Music was the soul of the counterculture. The Beatles, who started as a clean-cut pop band, grew increasingly experimental and psychedelic, releasing albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Magical Mystery Tour that were clearly influenced by cannabis and LSD. They sang openly about drug use in songs like Got to Get You Into My Life, though they often used code that insiders understood and censors might miss. Bob Dylan, who had started as a folk singer, embraced electric rock and wrote increasingly surreal poetic lyrics that seemed to capture the consciousness-expanding experience of psychedelic drugs. His song Rainy Day Women Das 12 and 35 featured the repeated refrain, "Everybody must get stoned," a phrase that could technically refer to biblical stoning, but that everyone understood as a call to cannabis use. The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, The Doors. These bands defined the sound of the counterculture, and cannabis was woven into their music and their lives. Concerts became ritual spaces where thousands of young people gathered to hear music, smoke cannabis communally, and experience a sense of unity and transcendence that seemed impossible in straight society. The peak of the hippie movement, the moment that would become its enduring symbol, was Woodstock in August 1969. Nearly 500,000 people gathered on a farm in upstate New York for 3 days of music. The logistics were a disaster. There wasn't enough food, enough toilets, enough shelter. It rained, turning the farm into a muddy mess. But none of that mattered to most people who were there. Woodstock represented something profound. Proof that young people could create their own society, even if only temporarily, based on peace, music, sharing, and yes, drugs. Cannabis smoke hung over the crowd like fog. No one tried to hide what they were doing. In that moment on that farm, the drug war seemed irrelevant. 500,000 people were breaking federal law together, and no one cared. But Woodstock was also an ending as much as a peak. Within months, the idealism of the counterculture would begin to curdle. The violence at the Altamont Festival in December 1969, where a man was killed by Hell's Angels who had been hired as security, shattered the illusion that peace and love could conquer all. Charles Manson's murders, committed by young people who seemed superficially similar to hippies, created fear and revulsion. Heroin addiction and other hard drug use began claiming victims among countercultural figures, and the political establishment was fighting back. Richard Nixon, elected president in 1968, declared drug users public enemy number one and launched what he called a war on drugs. Nixon understood that he couldn't directly attack the anti-war movement or black civil rights activists, but he could criminalize their cultural practices. His own advisors would later admit that the drug war was designed to target these groups, to disrupt their communities and discredit their leaders. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, said explicitly in a 1994 interview, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." The hippie movement didn't end suddenly. It faded gradually through the 1970s as participants grew older, got jobs, started families, rejoined mainstream society in various ways. But the cultural impact persisted. The casual acceptance of cannabis use that exists today, the idea that smoking cannabis is a personal choice rather than a moral failing, has its roots in the counterculture's rejection of prohibition. The hippies proved that millions of people could use cannabis without turning into the violent maniacs of reefer madness propaganda. They demonstrated that cannabis prohibition was a political choice, not a scientific necessity. And they kept the flame alive during Prohibition's darkest decades, maintaining a cannabis culture that would eventually grow into a legalization movement. But the hippies weren't the only group transforming cannabis culture during this period. Thousands of miles away, on a small island in the Caribbean, another movement was emerging that would spread cannabis consciousness around the world through the vehicle of reggae music. The island of Jamaica sits in the Caribbean Sea, a former British colony that wouldn't achieve independence until 1962. For centuries, Jamaica's economy was built on sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans. Even after slavery was abolished in the 1830s, the descendants of those enslaved people remained poor, marginalized, denied education and political power by a white colonial elite. In 1930, something happened that would change Jamaican culture forever. In Ethiopia, a man named Ras Tafari was crowned emperor, taking the name Haile Selassie I. To most of the world, this was just another coronation, another African ruler taking power. But to some black Jamaicans, searching for identity and dignity in a society that treated them as inferior, Haile Selassie's coronation was prophecy fulfilled. Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican political leader and Pan-African activist, had proclaimed in the 1920s, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a black king, he shall be the Redeemer." When Haile Selassie, a black emperor claiming descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, was crowned in Ethiopia, some Jamaicans believed Garvey's prophecy had come true. They began to worship Selassie as the returned Messiah, the living God incarnate. They took the name Rastafari from Selassie's birth name Rastafari. The Rastafari movement was small at first, a marginal religious sect considered bizarre and threatening by mainstream Jamaican society. Rastafari rejected many of the values of colonial culture. They grew their hair into dreadlocks, which white Jamaicans considered uncivilized. They read the Bible but interpreted it in ways that put black people at the center of God's plan, claiming that white people had corrupted the original message. They rejected participation in colonial institutions, refusing to vote or cooperate with the government they viewed as illegitimate. And they smoked cannabis, which they called ganja or the holy herb. They believed cannabis was a sacrament mentioned in the Bible, a gift from God that brought wisdom and spiritual insight. They smoked it ritually, before and during reasoning sessions, communal gatherings where they discussed theology and current events. They smoked it from chalice pipes, water pipes carved from coconut shells or other natural materials. They believed that cannabis brought them closer to Jah, their name for God, and helped them understand spiritual truths that were hidden from those who remained trapped in Babylon, their term for corrupt modern society. Cannabis had been introduced to Jamaica in the 1840s by indentured servants from India, brought to the island to work on plantations after slavery ended. These Indian workers brought their traditional uses of cannabis with them, and over time, cannabis cultivation and use spread through Jamaican society, particularly among the poor. By the time Rastafari emerged in the 1930s, cannabis was already part of Jamaican culture, though it was officially illegal, banned by colonial authorities who viewed it as a threat to order and productivity. For Rastafari, this prohibition was more evidence of Babylon's corruption. How could a herb given by God be illegal? The criminalization of cannabis was, in their view, part of the oppression of black people, an attempt to deny them access to spiritual truth and natural medicine. So they continued to use cannabis despite its illegal status, accepting persecution as the price of spiritual authenticity. Through the 1930s, 40s and 50s, Rastafari remained a small, marginal movement. Mainstream Jamaican society, both black and white, viewed Rastafari with suspicion or contempt. Their dreadlocks, their cannabis use, their rejection of colonial values made them targets for police harassment and social discrimination. Many Rastafari withdrew into rural communities where they could practice their faith with less interference, growing their own food, living simply, smoking their sacred herb, and waiting for the day when they would return to Africa, to Zion, to the Promised Land. But everything changed in the 1960s and 70s with the rise of reggae music. Reggae emerged from earlier Jamaican musical styles like ska and rocksteady, but it had its own distinctive sound, a slow, heavy rhythm, bass-driven and hypnotic, with lyrics that often dealt with social justice, spirituality, and resistance to oppression. Many early reggae musicians were Rastafari, or influenced by Rastafari ideas, and their music began to carry Rastafari messages to a global audience. The greatest of these musical ambassadors was Bob Marley. Born Robert Nesta Marley in 1945, he grew up in poverty in rural Jamaica. He moved to Kingston as a teenager, formed a band called the Wailers with Peter Tosh and Bunny Wailer, and began recording music. In the late 1960s, Marley converted to Rastafari after witnessing the massive crowds that greeted Haile Selassie when the emperor visited Jamaica in 1966. Rastafari transformed Marley. He grew dreadlocks, began smoking cannabis daily as a spiritual practice, and infused his music with Rastafari theology and social critique. His songs spoke of Jah, of Babylon, of the need to resist oppression and seek spiritual truth. And he was explicit about cannabis in his lyrics, calling it the healing of the nations, comparing it to a tree of life, describing how it brought wisdom and insight. Songs like Kaya, Easy Skanking, and Trenchtown Rock celebrated cannabis openly. In Kaya, Marley sings about feeling so high and getting stoned while the sun shines down. The message was unmistakable. Cannabis was good, natural, a source of joy and peace. This wasn't coded language. This was open celebration of a plant that was illegal almost everywhere in the world. In the 1970s, Marley's music exploded globally. Albums like Catch a Fire, Burnin', Natty Dread, and Exodus were huge international successes. Marley became one of the world's most recognizable musicians, and his image, dreadlocks and all, became iconic. He was selling out stadiums in Europe and America, spreading his message of peace, justice, and spiritual consciousness through reggae music. And everywhere Marley went, he brought cannabis. Not literally, though he certainly smoked it constantly despite its illegality. But culturally, Marley made cannabis visible and acceptable in new ways. Here was a serious artist, a spiritual man, someone who spoke eloquently about justice and peace, and he was absolutely open about his cannabis use. He didn't hide it or apologize for it. He celebrated it as a sacrament, a gift from God, a path to wisdom. Marley's influence on global cannabis culture cannot be overstated. He brought knowledge of Rastafari to millions of people who had never heard of the faith. He presented an alternative to the hippie model of cannabis use, not recreation or rebellion for its own sake, but a serious spiritual practice rooted in religious tradition. And he did it all while remaining true to his faith, never compromising his message to achieve mainstream acceptance. When Marley died of cancer in 1981 at just 36 years old, he was already a legend. His funeral in Jamaica drew enormous crowds. He was given a state funeral, an extraordinary honour for someone who had been a critic of government and mainstream society. And in the decades since his death, his influence has only grown. Bob Marley is recognised around the world not just as a musician, but as a spiritual figure, a voice for the oppressed, and a symbol of cannabis consciousness. Rastafari itself has spread far beyond Jamaica. There are Rastafari communities on every continent, from Africa to Europe to Asia to the Americas. Most remain small, but they've maintained the core practices and beliefs: worship of Jah, reverence for Africa, and Haile Selassie, dreadlocks, vegetarian diet, and ritual use of cannabis as a sacrament. In recent years, some governments have begun to recognize Rastafari's right to use cannabis as a religious sacrament. In 2023, Antigua and Barbuda became one of the first Caribbean nations to grant Rastafari official authorization to grow and use cannabis for religious purposes. Jamaica itself, while still maintaining general cannabis prohibition, has created exemptions for Rastafari sacramental use. These are small steps, but they represent acknowledgement that cannabis prohibition has been used to persecute religious minorities, and that religious freedom should include the right to use sacred plants. The story of Rastafari and cannabis is a reminder that spiritual use of psychoactive plants isn't just ancient history. New religious traditions continue to emerge that incorporate these plants in meaningful ways. Rastafari joins Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and other traditions in maintaining that cannabis has sacred value, that it can be a path to divine connection. That prohibition of such a plant is not just bad policy, but a violation of religious freedom. As cannabis legalization spreads, Rastafari teachings become increasingly relevant. They offer a model of respectful, intentional use. Cannabis not as a recreational drug to be consumed thoughtlessly, but as a sacrament to be approached with reverence. Whether one accepts Rastafari theology or not, the movement demonstrates that cannabis use can be integrated into a coherent spiritual practice that emphasizes peace, justice, and connection to the divine. Through the 1980s and early 1990s, the war on drugs raged with increasing intensity. Mandatory minimum sentences sent people to prison for years for possessing small amounts of drugs. Police departments received military equipment and training for drug raids. The prison population exploded, with drug offenders making up an ever larger proportion of inmates. And cannabis, despite being far less dangerous than drugs like heroin or cocaine, was caught up in this punitive system. But even as prohibition hardened, countercurrents were emerging. Scientists, despite government obstacles, were beginning to study cannabis systematically. Patients were discovering that cannabis could help with conditions that prescription drugs couldn't effectively treat. And activists were organizing to challenge prohibition, using both legal and civil disobedience strategies. The AIDS epidemic of the 1980s was a catalyst for renewed medical cannabis activism. As HIV/AIDS killed tens of thousands of gay men, patients discovered that cannabis helped with multiple aspects of their illness. It reduced the severe nausea caused by HIV medications. It stimulated appetite when wasting syndrome threatened to starve them to death. It provided psychological relief from the terror of a disease that was, at that time, essentially a death sentence. But cannabis was illegal, and HIV-positive people who used it risked arrest and prosecution. Some patients and activists decided they weren't going to accept this. If cannabis was medicine, if it helped people survive who were dying, then prohibition was not just unjust but murderous. So they organized. They created underground networks to provide cannabis to AIDS patients. They held protests and civil disobedience actions, smoking cannabis publicly and daring police to arrest them. They challenged the government's claim that cannabis had no medical value. In San Francisco, a man named Dennis Perron became a key figure in this movement. Perron was gay and HIV positive himself. He had watched his partner die of AIDS. He believed passionately that cannabis was medicine and that sick people had a right to use it. In the early 1990s, Perron opened the Cannabis Buyers Club in San Francisco, openly selling cannabis to anyone with a doctor's recommendation. This was completely illegal under state and federal law, but Perron calculated that San Francisco authorities wouldn't crack down on an organization that was clearly providing medicine to dying patients. He was right. The Cannabis Buyers Club operated for years, becoming a model for the medical cannabis dispensaries that would later spread across California and other states. But Perron wanted more than tolerance. He wanted legalization. In 1996, he and other activists gathered enough signatures to put Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, on California's ballot. Prop 215 was written to be simple and broad. It stated that seriously ill Californians had the right to obtain and use cannabis for medical purposes with a doctor's recommendation. It didn't specify which medical conditions qualified. It didn't create a state licensing system or regulations. It just said that if your doctor thought cannabis might help you, you should be allowed to use it without fear of state prosecution. The campaign was contentious. Opponents, including the California Police Chiefs Association and many politicians, claimed that Prop 215 was just a backdoor to legalization, that it would make cannabis available to anyone who wanted it for any reason. Supporters argued that sick people shouldn't have to break the law to get medicine that helped them. They put forward patients, people with cancer and AIDS and chronic pain, who testified about how cannabis had improved their lives. In November 1996, California voters approved Prop 215 by a margin of 56% to 44%. It was a watershed moment. For the first time since federal prohibition was enacted, a state had explicitly legalized cannabis, even if only for medical purposes. The federal government immediately objected, threatening to prosecute doctors who recommended cannabis and patients who used it. But California stood firm, and other states began to follow its lead. The medical cannabis movement of the late 1990s and 2000s was often messy and controversial. The dispensaries that opened in California and other states were sometimes barely distinguishable from recreational cannabis sellers. The recommendation system was easy to abuse, with some doctors essentially selling recommendations to anyone who paid the fee. But underneath the abuses and the confusion, something important was happening. Millions of people were discovering that cannabis could be used as medicine. Not a cure-all, not a miracle drug, but a real medicine that helped with real conditions. And as more people had direct experience with medical cannabis, either using it themselves or knowing someone who did, the old prohibitionist arguments became harder to sustain. If cannabis was helping people, if it was making lives better rather than destroying them, what was the justification for prohibition? At the same time, scientific research was finally able to move forward after decades of restriction. In the 1990s, researchers discovered the endocannabinoid system, a complex network of receptors throughout the brain and body that respond to cannabinoids. They learned that the human body produces its own cannabis-like chemicals, and that external cannabinoids from cannabis work by mimicking and enhancing these natural processes. This was a profound discovery. It meant that cannabis wasn't just some foreign substance that happened to have effects on the brain. It was interacting with a system that existed in our bodies for other purposes, a system involved in regulating pain, mood, appetite, memory, and many other functions. Understanding the endocannabinoid system opened up new possibilities for both cannabis-based medicines and for synthetic drugs that targeted the same receptors. Clinical research confirmed that cannabis and cannabinoids could be effective for certain conditions. Chronic pain, particularly neuropathic pain that didn't respond well to opioids, nausea and appetite loss from cancer chemotherapy, muscle spasticity and multiple sclerosis. Certain forms of epilepsy, particularly in children, where CBD, one of cannabis's non-intoxicating compounds, could dramatically reduce seizure frequency. None of this research claimed that cannabis was a panacea or that it worked for everyone. Medical cannabis, like any medicine, works better for some people and some conditions than others. Some patients find it transformative, others find it doesn't help much or has side effects they don't like. But the research made clear that cannabis absolutely has medical value, that the Schedule I classification claiming it has no currently accepted medical use was scientifically indefensible. As medical cannabis became more accepted and more states legalized it, activists began pushing for full legalization, not just for medical use, but for adults generally. The arguments were pragmatic rather than idealistic. Prohibition wasn't working. It was wasting money, destroying lives through incarceration, and doing nothing to reduce cannabis use. Regulation, like alcohol regulation, would be more effective and more just. In 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington approved initiatives legalizing recreational cannabis for adults. This was an even bigger breakthrough than medical legalization. These states weren't just creating exemptions for sick people. They were rejecting prohibition entirely, saying that adults should be free to use cannabis just as they're free to use alcohol. The federal government could have cracked down. They could have sent federal agents to shut down cannabis businesses and arrest everyone involved. But the Obama administration chose not to. They issued guidance saying that as long as states created strong regulatory systems that prevented sales to minors, prevented interstate trafficking, and prevented other problems, federal prosecutors wouldn't prioritize enforcement against state legal cannabis operations. This hands-off policy allowed the legalization experiment to proceed. Colorado and Washington set up licensing systems for cannabis growers, processors, and sellers. They created testing requirements to ensure products were safe and accurately labeled. They imposed taxes and used the revenue for schools, drug treatment, and other public purposes. And they demonstrated that legalization didn't cause the disasters that opponents had predicted. More states followed: Alaska, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, Nevada, Maine, Vermont, Michigan. By 2025, more than half of US states have legalized cannabis in some form. The tide has turned decisively. Public opinion polls show majority support for legalization. Even many Republicans, traditionally the party of law and order, now support allowing states to make their own decisions about cannabis policy. But legalization hasn't been without problems and contradictions. The legal cannabis industry is overwhelmingly white-owned and white-managed, despite the fact that Black and Hispanic communities bore the brunt of prohibition. Many people are making fortunes selling cannabis legally, while hundreds of thousands remain in prison for cannabis offenses that would no longer be crimes. Some states have tried to address this through expungement programs and social equity provisions, but progress has been slow. The science of cannabis is still developing. We're learning more about different strains and their effects, about the various cannabinoids and terpenes and how they interact, about best practices for cultivation and extraction. Medical cannabis is becoming more sophisticated, with products designed for specific conditions rather than generic flower. And cannabis culture itself is evolving. The old stereotypes of the lazy stoner are giving way to a more nuanced understanding. Cannabis users include doctors and lawyers, athletes and business executives, parents and grandparents. They use cannabis for many reasons, some medical, some recreational, some spiritual, some simply because they prefer it to alcohol. As prohibition crumbles, we're recovering knowledge that was nearly lost. Ancient techniques for preparing and using cannabis are being rediscovered and combined with modern science. The spiritual traditions that maintained cannabis use through the Prohibition years are being recognized as legitimate, and the plant itself, after decades of being grown in secrecy with no quality control, is being cultivated openly with attention to quality, sustainability, and the diverse effects that different varieties can produce. The story isn't over. Federal prohibition remains in the United States, though it seems increasingly unstable. Many other countries are beginning their own journeys toward legalization or decriminalization. The question of how to repair the damage done by prohibition, how to provide justice for those who were incarcerated and communities that were devastated, remains largely unanswered. But what we can say is that the long night of prohibition is ending. The lies and propaganda that sustained it for nearly a century are being exposed. The plant that humans have used for 10,000 years is being welcomed back into society, not as a dangerous drug, but as what it always was: a useful, relatively safe plant with fiber, food, medical, and psychoactive properties that can be used responsibly by people who understand it. It's late now. It wasn't the first time legalization had been attempted. Various decriminalization efforts had happened in the 1970s, and there had been advocacy for medical access for decades. But Prop 215 was different. It was a successful, voter-approved initiative that directly contradicted federal drug law and announced that at least in California, doctors could recommend cannabis, and patients could use it without fear of state prosecution. The passage of Prop 215 was the result of years of grassroots organizing, particularly within the AIDS community. In the 1980s and 1990s, as the AIDS epidemic was killing thousands of gay men, many discovered that cannabis helped with the nausea from HIV medications, stimulated appetite at a time when wasting syndrome was a deadly problem, and provided psychological relief from the terror of a fatal illness. AIDS activists became some of the most passionate advocates for medical cannabis access, arguing that denying dying patients a medicine that provided relief was cruel and indefensible. The federal government opposed Prop 215 and threatened to prosecute doctors who recommended cannabis. But California stood firm, and other states began to follow. Oregon and Washington passed medical cannabis laws in 1998. Alaska and Maine followed in 1999. By the early 2000s, a growing number of states had medical cannabis programs, creating a patchwork of state laws that contradicted federal prohibition. This put cannabis in a strange legal position: legal under state law, illegal under federal law, creating a situation where state legal cannabis businesses and patients could theoretically be prosecuted by federal authorities. For the most part, federal prosecutors focused on large-scale trafficking organizations and left small-scale medical cannabis operations alone, but the threat of federal prosecution always loomed. The real turning point came in 2012, when Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize cannabis for recreational adult use. These weren't medical programs with restrictions and registry requirements. These were full legalization, allowing adults to purchase and use cannabis much as they could purchase and use alcohol. Other states quickly followed: Alaska, Oregon, California, Massachusetts, Nevada, Maine, Vermont. As of 2025, more than half of US states have legalized cannabis in some form, either for medical use, recreational use, or both. Canada legalized cannabis nationwide in 2018. Uruguay had done so in 2013. Mexico, Germany, and other countries are in various stages of legalization or decriminalization. The global consensus around cannabis prohibition, which had seemed immovable for decades, is crumbling, but this change hasn't come without complications and contradictions. The legal cannabis industry in states where it's been legalized is overwhelmingly white-owned, despite the fact that Black and Hispanic communities bore the brunt of prohibition and the war on drugs. Many people are making fortunes selling cannabis legally, while hundreds of thousands remain imprisoned for cannabis offenses that would no longer be crimes in their states. Some states have tried to address this through expungement programs and social equity licenses that give priority to people from communities affected by the war on drugs. But progress has been slow and uneven. Scientific research on cannabis has expanded dramatically as legalization has advanced. We now know far more about how cannabis works in the human body than we did even 20 years ago. We've discovered the endocannabinoid system, a complex network of receptors throughout the brain and body that respond to cannabinoids. We've learned that the human body produces its own cannabinoid-like chemicals, and that cannabis works by mimicking and enhancing these natural processes. Research has confirmed that cannabis can be effective for treating certain types of chronic pain, for reducing nausea and stimulating appetite in cancer and AIDS patients, for reducing seizures in certain forms of epilepsy, and for treating symptoms of various other conditions. It's not a miracle drug and it doesn't work for everyone, but for some patients, Cannabis provides relief that conventional medicines can't match. At the same time, research has also clarified that cannabis isn't entirely harmless. Heavy use, particularly starting in adolescence, can affect cognitive development and may increase risk for certain mental health issues in vulnerable individuals. Driving under the influence of cannabis impairs reaction time and judgment, making it dangerous. Some people do develop problematic patterns of use that interfere with their lives. These risks are real and shouldn't be dismissed, but compared to the apocalyptic scenarios painted by prohibition advocates, where cannabis was supposed to lead inevitably to violence, insanity, and moral collapse, the actual risks are relatively modest. Cannabis is not physically addictive the way heroin or alcohol are. It doesn't cause overdose deaths. Long-term health impacts are generally much less severe than those of alcohol or tobacco. In the broader landscape of psychoactive substances, cannabis is toward the safer end of the spectrum. As legalization has progressed, we've seen what happens when cannabis is regulated rather than prohibited. Far from the chaos that opponents predicted, legal cannabis states have generally seen decreases in youth use, no increases in traffic fatalities beyond what can be explained by overall increases in miles driven, and the development of regulated markets where products are tested for safety, and consumers have reliable information about what they're buying. The tax revenue from legal cannabis has been substantial, billions of dollars that states have used for education, drug treatment programs, public health initiatives, and other purposes. Law enforcement has been freed from the burden of enforcing cannabis prohibition, allowing police to focus on more serious crimes, and hundreds of thousands of people who would have been arrested for cannabis possession are instead living their lives without the devastating consequences of a criminal record. But perhaps most importantly, legalization has begun to undo some of the cultural damage of prohibition. For decades, official propaganda taught that cannabis users were criminals, degenerates, losers. The reality, which has become impossible to deny as legalization has advanced, is that cannabis users are ordinary people, your neighbors, your co-workers, perhaps your family members. They're nurses and teachers, lawyers and construction workers, parents and grandparents. They use cannabis responsibly, the way most people use alcohol responsibly, and it doesn't define their lives or turn them into the stereotypes prohibition created. This normalization of cannabis, this recognition that it's a relatively benign substance that some people choose to use, feels like it should have happened decades ago. It should never have been prohibited in the first place. The scientific evidence didn't support prohibition, and the racial motivations behind it were unconscionable. But for various reasons, political, economic, and cultural, we took a wrong turn in the early 20th century, and it's taken until the early 21st to begin correcting it. The question now is what happens next? Will federal prohibition in the United States eventually end? Will international treaties that currently require cannabis prohibition be amended? Will more countries follow the path toward legalization? And perhaps most importantly, will the communities that were most harmed by prohibition see justice, not just through legalization but through active efforts to repair the damage done? These questions remain open. But what we can say with certainty is that the story of cannabis has come full circle. A plant that was revered by our ancestors, used in medicine and ceremony for thousands of years, that was woven into the fabric of human civilization in countless ways, was nearly lost to us through misguided prohibition. But it's returning now, being rediscovered, its ancient knowledge being recovered and combined with modern science. It's late now, perhaps later than when you started listening. The darkness outside your window is deeper, the world is quieter, and we've travelled together through 10,000 years of human history, following a single plant as it wound its way through civilization after civilization, culture after culture. We began on an island off the coast of China, with ancient people pressing hemp cords into wet clay. We walked through the Yangshao settlements along the Yellow River, where hemp was one of the 5 sacred grains. We climbed to the Pamir Mountains and sat in smoke-filled tents with ancient mourners, helping them process their grief. We joined Scythian warriors in their vapour baths, howling with joy after funeral rites. We travelled to India and learned how Shiva discovered cannabis in the mountains, how it became one of Hinduism's 5 sacred plants, how sadhus and devotees still use it today in their spiritual practices. We stood in ancient Egypt and read medical papyri that prescribed cannabis for dozens of ailments. We followed trade routes from China to Persia to Egypt, watching knowledge spread and transform. We moved forward through medieval Islam and the controversies over hashish. We crossed the Atlantic with European colonists who grew hemp for rope but forgot it was medicine. We watched as prohibition took hold, driven by racism and lies, and we've seen, in our own time, how the tide is finally beginning to turn, how truth is reasserting itself after a century of propaganda. What have we learned from this long journey? Perhaps that humans have always sought ways to alter consciousness, to ease pain, to explore the boundaries of ordinary experience. That plants have been our partners in this exploration, offering their chemistry to us, if we're wise enough to use them properly. That knowledge can be lost, buried under prejudice and politics, but that it has a way of resurfacing eventually. That history is not a straight line of progress, but a cycle of forgetting and remembering, losing and rediscovering. Cannabis, this ordinary and extraordinary plant, has survived everything humans have thrown at it. Cultivation and prohibition, reverence and demonization, medicine and madness. It's still here, still growing, still offering its gifts to those who approach it with respect and knowledge. In some ways, we're just now beginning to understand what our ancestors knew intuitively, that this plant has something valuable to offer, whether that's fibre for our tools, medicine for our bodies, or a door to altered states of consciousness that can teach us something about the nature of the mind itself. The story isn't over. It's still being written, in state legislatures and research laboratories, in courtrooms and grow rooms, in the minds of people who are rediscovering ancient knowledge and combining it with modern science. The next chapters are being written right now, tonight, as you listen to these words. But for tonight, our journey ends here. 10,000 years compressed into a few hours. Stone Age pottery and schedule like classification, sacred herbs and criminal enterprises, Scythian warriors and California dispensaries. It's all the same plant, the same human relationship, the same story being told again and again across cultures and centuries. Sleep well, knowing that you carry this history with you now, that you understand something profound about how humans and plants have co-evolved, how culture shapes our relationship with nature, how politics and power can distort truth, and how knowledge, once nearly lost, can be recovered. The night is deep. Let yourself drift now. Let the story settle into your mind like sediment through water. Tomorrow is its own story.